The Blood Moon Honeymoon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine wilderness of Banff National Park as Emily Catherine Harris stepped out of their rented Toyota Highlander, her hiking boots crunching softly on the gravel of the Bow Valley Parkway trailhead. At 26, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that required no enhancement: auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper wire, emerald eyes that sparkled with an infectious enthusiasm for life, and a smile that had first captured Jacob's attention 3 years earlier at a mutual friend's barbecue in Denver. She wore her favorite hiking outfit: well-worn Patagonia cargo pants, a moisture-wicking long-sleeve shirt in forest green, and a lightweight down vest that brought out the color of her eyes. Her wedding ring, still so new she found herself unconsciously twirling it around her finger, caught the early morning light as she reached for her fully loaded Osprey backpack. "Can you believe we're actually here, Jake?" Emily called out, her voice carrying across the crisp mountain air with pure joy. "Mrs. Emily Harris is about to conquer the Canadian Rockies." She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and performed a little spin that made her hair catch the sunlight in brilliant copper highlights. Her laughter echoed off the surrounding peaks of Mount Temple and Mount Aberdeen, two massive limestone sentinels that stood guard over the Bow Valley like ancient stone monuments. Jacob Michael Harris, 28 years old and built like the former college rugby player he was, emerged from the driver's side with his characteristic easy grin, the same smile that had convinced Emily to say yes when he proposed 6 months earlier on the summit of Mount Evans, back home in Colorado. His sandy brown hair was tousled from the drive, and his blue eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, a feature that had deepened during their 3-year courtship. He stood 6'2" in his hiking boots, with broad shoulders that filled out his technical hiking shirt, and strong hands that bore calluses from his work as a structural engineer for Morrison Construction. The wedding band on his left hand was simple, brushed platinum, chosen to match Emily's engagement ring setting. "I still can't believe you talked me into camping for our honeymoon instead of that resort in Maui you were eyeing," Jacob teased, hefting his own pack. A Gregory Baltoro loaded with their shelter, cooking equipment, and enough food for 5 days in the backcountry. Despite his words, his tone carried nothing but affection and excitement. The truth was, he would have followed Emily anywhere, even to the ends of the earth. Her adventurous spirit was one of the things he loved most about her, though it sometimes worried him how fearless she could be. Emily bounded over to him with the energy of someone who had been planning this trip for months, ever since they decided to combine their love of wilderness camping with their honeymoon celebration. She stood on her tiptoes to kiss his cheek, her lips soft and warm against his skin. "Because, my darling husband," she said, savoring the word husband as if it were a fine wine, "anyone can lie on a beach and drink Mai Tais. But how many couples can say they spent their honeymoon under the stars in one of the most beautiful places on earth? Besides, we'll have plenty of beach vacations in our future. This is once in a lifetime." The parking area around them was filling up with other outdoor enthusiasts despite the early hour, barely past 7 in the morning. A family from Toronto was organizing gear near a silver minivan, while their 3 children, aged roughly 8 to 14, bounced around with the pent-up energy of kids excited for adventure. The father, a thin man with graying temples named Robert Chen, according to the permit Jacob had overheard him discussing with a ranger, was methodically checking items off a laminated list, while his wife Margaret helped their youngest daughter adjust her junior-sized backpack. Their teenage son, David, seemed more interested in his smartphone than the surrounding wilderness, though his parents were clearly working to change that attitude. Near the Trailhead Information Kiosk, an elderly couple from Calgary, Harold and Dorothy Whitman, both in their 70s but surprisingly spry, were studying a topographical map with the intense concentration of people who had been hiking these mountains for decades. Harold wore a faded ball cap from the Calgary Flames hockey team and kept pointing to various trail junctions, while Dorothy nodded and made notes in a small leather journal. They moved with the careful precision of experienced backcountry travelers who understood that preparation could mean the difference between a memorable adventure and a dangerous situation. At the far end of the parking area, a group of 6 college students from the University of Alberta were making considerably more noise than anyone else as they distributed group gear and argued good-naturedly about who had forgotten to pack the water purification tablets. Their leader appeared to be a young woman named Sarah McKinnon, an outdoor recreation major with short blonde hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested extensive wilderness experience. Her boyfriend, Mike Stevens, a geology student, was trying to mediate a dispute between 2 other group members about the proper way to pack a bear canister, while Sarah double-checked their permit paperwork. Jacob pulled out his own copy of their backcountry permit, a document they had applied for months in advance and which represented countless hours of planning and preparation. The permit authorized them to camp at designated Site B-47 along the Upper Bow River Trail, a remote location approximately 18 kilometers from the trailhead that promised solitude, spectacular mountain views, and access to some of the best fishing in the park. According to the detailed trail descriptions Emily had researched obsessively, their campsite sat beside a pristine alpine lake, surrounded by towering peaks and fed by a waterfall that cascaded down from glacial fields thousands of feet above. "Permit looks good. All our gear is accounted for, and we've got 5 days of perfect weather ahead of us," Jacob announced, consulting the weather forecast on his GPS device one final time. The extended forecast called for daytime temperatures in the low 70s Fahrenheit, with nighttime lows dropping to around 40 degrees. Perfect conditions for hiking and camping, with clear skies predicted for the entire duration of their stay. Emily was practically vibrating with excitement as she performed final adjustments to her pack straps and checked the contents of her hip belt pockets. She had packed with the meticulous care of someone who understood that every ounce mattered when you would be carrying everything you needed for 5 days on your back. Her pack contained her share of their shelter system, a lightweight 2-person tent that weighed just over 3 pounds, along with her personal clothing, toiletries, first aid supplies, and half of their food. The food had been carefully planned and pre-portioned into meals, with each day's breakfast, lunch, and dinner sealed in separate Ziploc bags and labeled with permanent marker. "Did you remember to tell your parents where we're going?" Jacob asked, though he knew Emily well enough to be certain she had covered every detail. She was the type of person who made backup plans for her backup plans, a trait that served them well in the wilderness where being unprepared could quickly become dangerous. "Already done," Emily replied, patting the side pocket of her pack where she kept her emergency communication device, a satellite messenger that could send their GPS coordinates to emergency services if needed. "I sent them our itinerary, permit numbers, expected return date, and emergency contact information. Plus, I've got check-in times scheduled every 12 hours. She paused and grinned at him. "Though I'm hoping we'll be too busy enjoying married life in paradise to worry about the outside world." The trailhead itself was a modest affair, a wooden sign marking the beginning of the Upper Bow River Trail, an information kiosk containing maps and safety warnings, and a small parking area carved out of the forest. The trail began as a well-maintained path roughly 4 feet wide, packed earth and stone that had been worn smooth by thousands of boots over the decades. Ancient Douglas firs and Engelmann spruces towered overhead, their massive trunks creating a natural cathedral that filtered the morning sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. As they approached the trail register, a weathered wooden box where hikers were required to sign in and out for safety purposes, Emily noticed the previous entries with the keen interest of someone who loved reading about other people's adventures. The most recent entry dated just the day before, was from a solo hiker named Marcus Thompson from Seattle, who was attempting an ambitious 20-mile hike circuit through some of the park's most remote terrain. Before that, a group of 4 experienced mountaineers from Vancouver had signed in for a technical climbing expedition to Mount Assiniboine, a challenging peak that required advanced skills and specialized equipment. Jacob carefully filled out their entry in the trail register, noting their names, home address, group size, intended route, expected return date, and emergency contact information. His handwriting was neat and precise, reflecting the same attention to detail that made him an excellent engineer. As he wrote, Emily read over his shoulder and double-checked each piece of information, a habit they had developed during their years of hiking together. Party of 2, Upper Bow River Trail to campsite B47, return expected June 15th, Jacob narrated as he wrote. Emergency contact, Robert and Patricia Harris, Denver, Colorado, phone number. He paused and looked at Emily. You know, it feels weird listing my parents as emergency contacts instead of yours. We're still getting used to this whole married thing. Emily laughed and bumped his shoulder with hers. We can list both sets of parents if it makes you feel better. Though I still think the chances of needing emergency contacts on our honeymoon are pretty much zero. What could go wrong in paradise? As they finished with the trail register and made final adjustments to their packs, the sounds of the wilderness began to replace the mechanical noises of the parking area behind them. Birds called from the canopy above, the distinctive whistle of a white-crowned sparrow, the harsh cry of a Steller's jay, and the drumming of a woodpecker somewhere deeper in the forest. A chipmunk scolded them from a nearby tree, chattering its displeasure at their presence in its territory. The air smelled of pine resin, wildflowers, and the clean scent of mountain water from the creek that paralleled the trail. Emily pulled out her digital camera, a high-end Canon DSLR that she had inherited from her grandfather and had been using to document their adventures for the past 3 years. She wanted to capture everything about this trip, their first major adventure as a married couple, the stunning scenery they would encounter, and all the small moments that would become precious memories in years to come. Her first photo was of Jacob standing beside the trailhead sign, his pack fully loaded and his face bright with anticipation. The morning light caught his features perfectly, highlighting the strong jawline and kind eyes that had first attracted her attention. "Okay, Mrs. Harris," Jacob said, shouldering his pack with the practiced ease of someone who had spent countless weekends in the mountains. "Ready to start our adventure?" Emily settled her own pack into position, adjusting the hip belt and tightening the shoulder straps until the weight distributed evenly across her frame. At 38 pounds fully loaded, her pack represented careful planning and ruthless elimination of unnecessary items. Every piece of gear had been chosen for its functionality and weight, from their ultralight tent to their titanium cooking pot to their carefully selected clothing system designed to keep them comfortable in a wide range of mountain weather conditions. "Ready," she declared, taking one last look around the parking area and civilized world they were leaving behind. In 5 days, they would return to this same spot as different people, not just because they would have shared an incredible adventure, but because they would have had their first real test as a married couple, working together to navigate challenges and support each other through the inevitable difficulties that arose during extended wilderness travel. The trail began with a gentle incline through dense forest, the path well-defined and clearly marked with occasional metal blazes attached to trees. For the first kilometer, they encountered other hikers regularly, day hikers out for shorter excursions, families with young children exploring the easier sections of the trail, and other backpackers heading to various destinations throughout the park. Emily chatted briefly with most of them, her natural friendliness and curiosity about other people's adventures making her a magnet for trail conversations. One such conversation was with Dr. Patricia Williams, a wildlife biologist from the University of Calgary who was conducting research on alpine plant communities. She was a woman in her early 50s, with greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of deep tan that came from spending most of her time outdoors. Her backpack bristled with scientific equipment, plant presses, soil sample containers, measuring devices, and a tablet computer sealed in a waterproof case. "You folks picked a beautiful time to be out here," Dr. Williams observed, adjusting her wide-brimmed sun hat as they paused at a trail junction. "The wildflower bloom is just reaching its peak at elevation, and we're having one of the mildest June weather patterns I've seen in years. Perfect conditions for your honeymoon adventure." "How did you know we were on our honeymoon?" Emily asked with a laugh, unconsciously touching her new wedding ring. Dr. Williams smiled knowingly. 23 years of marriage and 4 kids, and I can still recognize that particular glow. Plus, you keep calling each other Mr. and Mrs. Harris like you're trying out the sound of it. Congratulations, by the way. There's something special about sharing wilderness experiences as a married couple. Some of my best memories with my husband are from our camping trips in these mountains. Jacob and Emily exchanged a glance, both thinking the same thing, that they hoped to be saying something similar 23 years from now, still adventuring together and still as in love as they felt at this moment. "Any advice for wilderness newlyweds?" Jacob asked, genuinely curious about this woman's perspective on combining marriage and outdoor adventure. "Support each other's strengths and be patient with each other's weaknesses," Dr. Williams replied without hesitation. "The mountains have a way of stripping away all the superficial stuff and showing you who someone really is under pressure. If you can camp together successfully, you can probably handle whatever life throws at you. Oh, and always pack extra food. Nothing tests a relationship like being hungry and tired at the same time." As they prepared to continue hiking, Dr. Williams added something that would later seem prophetic. "You're heading up toward the B47 area, right? Beautiful country up there, some of the most remote and pristine wilderness in the park. Just remember that you're visitors in the animals' home. Keep a clean camp, store your food properly, and make noise when you're moving through areas with limited visibility. The wildlife up there includes everything from marmots to mountain goats to black bears, and occasionally grizzlies passing through on their way to higher elevation feeding areas." Emily felt a small shiver at the mention of bears, though she quickly dismissed it as just the natural caution that any responsible wilderness traveler should feel. They had taken a bear safety course before their trip, carried bear spray, and planned to use proper food storage techniques throughout their stay. The statistical likelihood of a dangerous bear encounter was vanishingly small, especially for prepared hikers who followed established safety protocols. After bidding farewell to Dr. Williams, they continued up the trail as it began to climb more steeply through increasingly spectacular country. The forest around them gradually transitioned from the dense mixed woods near the trailhead to more open stands of subalpine fir and whitebark pine. The understory became more sparse as they gained elevation, replaced by low-growing huckleberry bushes, kinnikinnick, and patches of colorful wildflowers that Emily stopped to photograph at regular intervals. The trail crossed numerous small creeks and streams, each one requiring them to hop from rock to rock or balance carefully across fallen logs that served as natural bridges. The water was incredibly clear and cold, fed by snowmelt and underground springs higher up the mountain. Jacob filled their water bottles at each major creek crossing, using their portable filtration system to ensure the water was safe to drink. The filter removed bacteria, protozoa, and other pathogens, while leaving the water tasting clean and fresh. As the morning progressed and they settled into their hiking rhythm, Emily and Jacob fell into the comfortable conversation patterns they had developed over 3 years of shared adventures. They talked about everything and nothing, their hopes for married life, funny stories from their wedding reception just 2 weeks earlier, plans for the house they were hoping to buy in the fall, and speculation about what their children might look like someday. The physical exertion of hiking with loaded packs prevented extended conversations, but they maintained an almost constant stream of short exchanges punctuated by comfortable silences. "Mile marker 5, Jacob announced as they passed a small wooden post beside the trail. "According to the map, we've got about 8 more miles to our campsite, and we're making good time." Emily consulted her GPS device and compared their position to the detailed topographic map she carried in a waterproof case attached to her pack strap. "We've gained about 1,500 feet of elevation so far, and we've got another 1,000 feet to go before we start descending toward the lake. The steepest section should be coming up in the next couple of miles." The steepest section turned out to be a series of switchbacks that climbed through a massive boulder field, left behind by some ancient rock slide. The trail here was narrower and more challenging, requiring careful foot placement on loose rock and occasional scrambling over larger obstacles. Emily's photography became more sporadic as the hiking demanded more of her attention, though she still managed to capture images of Jacob navigating particularly dramatic sections of the trail. During one rest break in the shadow of an enormous granite boulder, they encountered another group that would later feature prominently in the investigation that followed their disappearance. This was a group of 3 serious mountaineers from Canmore, experienced climbers named Kevin Martinez, Lisa Chen, and James Robertson, who were on their way to attempt a technical route on Mount Victoria. All 3 were in their 30s, lean and weathered from years of alpine climbing, and carried the kind of lightweight technical gear that marked them as experts rather than recreational hikers. Kevin Martinez, the apparent leader of the group, was a professional mountain guide who had been climbing in the Canadian Rockies for over 15 years. His pack was noticeably smaller than Jacob and Emily's, despite the technical nature of their expedition, a testament to his ability to pare gear down to absolute essentials. He wore approach shoes instead of hiking boots, carried ice axes strapped to his pack, and had the kind of easy confidence that came from extensive experience in dangerous mountain terrain. "You folks look like you're having a good time," Kevin observed as they shared the shaded rest spot. "Honeymoon trip?" Emily laughed, wondering if they were really that obvious. "Does everyone in Canada have some kind of honeymoon radar? You're the second person today who's figured that out." "It's the way you look at each other," Lisa Chen chimed in. She was a veterinarian from Calgary who climbed as a serious hobby and had summited peaks all over North America. "Plus, most married couples who've been together for a while don't hold hands quite as much on the trail." The conversation that followed was typical of wilderness encounters between compatible groups. They compared routes, shared information about trail conditions ahead, and exchanged stories from previous adventures. Kevin mentioned that they had started hiking well before dawn and had already covered 12 miles, planning to reach their base camp below Mount Victoria by early afternoon. Their timeline was much more aggressive than Jacob and Emily's leisurely pace, but then again, they weren't carrying honeymoon gear or planning to spend time relaxing at their destination. "We passed your intended camping area yesterday on a scouting trip," James Robertson mentioned. He was a software engineer from Toronto who spent every vacation pursuing increasingly difficult climbing objectives. "Absolutely beautiful spot. One of the most scenic campsites in the park. You'll have the lake pretty much to yourselves at this time of year. Most people don't want to carry heavy packs that far unless they're climbers heading to specific objectives." "Any wildlife activity up there?" Jacob asked, partly out of curiosity and partly from the responsible caution that wilderness travel demanded. Kevin and Lisa exchanged a glance that Emily later wished she had paid more attention to. "Some bear sign along the lakeshore. Kevin replied carefully. Mostly old tracks and scat. Nothing recent or concerning. Black bear activity, from what we could tell. Pretty normal for this area at this time of year. Just follow proper food storage protocols and you'll be fine. What Kevin didn't mention, because he didn't want to spoil their honeymoon with unnecessary worry, was that some of the tracks they had seen were considerably larger than typical black bear prints, and that his experienced eye had noticed several trees with claw marks that seemed unusually high up the trunks. He had also observed what appeared to be a daybed, a large depression in the vegetation where a big animal had rested near the trail about a mile below the B-47 campsite. None of these signs indicated immediate danger, but they suggested the presence of a large bear in the area, possibly a grizzly. After exchanging contact information and promising to share photos from their respective adventures, the two groups went their separate ways. Kevin, Lisa, and James continuing their rapid advance toward the technical climbing terrain, while Jacob and Emily resumed their more leisurely pace toward their lakeside campsite. The encounter left Emily feeling even more excited about their destination. The recommendation from experienced climbers carried significant weight, confirming that they had chosen well for their honeymoon adventure. The trail continued climbing through increasingly dramatic terrain as the morning wore on. They gained views of distant peaks that Emily tried to identify using the topographic map, though many remained shrouded in morning clouds that clung to the higher elevations. The vegetation became more sparse and alpine in character, with twisted trees that showed the effects of harsh winters and strong winds. Patches of snow lingered in shaded areas and high-elevation north faces, creating a landscape that seemed to exist at the boundary between seasons. By late morning, they reached what their map indicated was the high point of their route, a wind-swept saddle between two unnamed peaks that offered spectacular views in all directions. Behind them, they could see the entire Bow Valley spread out like a detailed topographic model, with the town of Banff visible as a small cluster of buildings in the distance. Ahead, the trail descended toward their destination through a dramatic landscape of alpine lakes, glacier-carved valleys, and towering rock walls that seemed to stretch to the sky. Emily spent nearly 30 minutes at the saddle, taking photographs from every possible angle, trying to capture not just the visual beauty, but the sense of scale and wilderness that surrounded them. Jacob posed for some shots, but mostly he just sat on a convenient rock and watched his wife work, marveling at her enthusiasm and the way she approached photography as both an art and a documentation project. Her dedication to recording their experiences had created an invaluable archive of their relationship, thousands of digital images that told the story of their courtship, engagement, and now marriage. "Can you believe this is our life?" Emily asked as she finally put the camera away and joined Jacob on his rock perch. The wind at this elevation was strong enough to require windbreakers, and they sat close together for warmth as they shared energy bars and water. 3 weeks ago, we were stressed about wedding planning and seating charts and whether the flowers would arrive on time, and now we're sitting on top of the world with nothing to worry about except which beautiful campsite to choose and what to cook for dinner. Jacob wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair beneath the technical fabric of her hiking hat. "I love that about you," he said quietly. "The way you can shift from wedding planning mode to wilderness adventure mode without missing a beat. Most people need more transition time between their regular life and something like this." "That's because most people think wilderness and regular life are two different things," Emily replied, leaning into his embrace. "But for me, this is just as real as anything we do back in Denver. Maybe more real, because out here you can't pretend to be someone you're not. The mountains don't care about your job title or your bank account or what kind of car you drive. They only care whether you're prepared, whether you respect the environment, and whether you can work as part of a team when things get challenging. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the wind and watching clouds move across the peaks around them. A pair of ravens played in the thermals below them, their calls echoing off the rock walls. In the distance, they could hear the sound of running water, probably the outlet stream from the lake, where they would be camping within a few hours. The descent from the saddle proved to be more challenging than the climb up had been. The trail switched back down through loose scree and rock slides that required careful attention to foot placement. Emily's knees began to ache from the constant jarring impact of downhill hiking with a heavy pack, a reminder that she was still building up her conditioning for extended backpacking trips. Jacob moved more easily on the descent, his rugby training and construction work having given him the kind of leg strength that made downhill hiking less punishing. They stopped for lunch beside a small alpine lake about halfway down the descent, finding a sandy spot near the shore where they could sit comfortably and soak their feet in the incredibly cold water. The lake was a perfect circle of deep blue water surrounded by granite walls and fed by a waterfall that plunged nearly 200 feet from a hanging valley above. Emily declared it the most beautiful lunch spot of her entire life and insisted on taking photos of their meal. Mountain House freeze-dried beef stroganoff, rehydrated with lake water and shared from a single lightweight titanium pot. "This is exactly what I pictured when I imagined our honeymoon," Emily said between bites of the surprisingly good freeze-dried meal. "Just you and me. Incredible scenery, no schedules to follow, no phones ringing, no obligations except to enjoy each other's company and explore this amazing place." Jacob nodded, though part of his mind was already thinking ahead to their campsite and the tasks that would need to be completed before dark, setting up camp, filtering water, organizing their food and gear, and preparing for their first night in bear country. He was naturally more focused on logistics than Emily, a trait that usually complemented her spontaneous nature, but sometimes created tension when she wanted to linger and enjoy a moment while he felt pressure to keep moving toward the next objective. "How much farther to camp?" he asked, consulting his GPS device and the increasingly detailed topographic map that showed their destination. Emily checked her own navigation tools and compared their current position to the campsite coordinates they had memorized. "Looks like about 4 more miles, mostly downhill with a few rolling sections. We should be there by mid-afternoon if we maintain our current pace." The final approach to campsite B47 took them through some of the most spectacular terrain they had encountered during the entire hike. The trail descended through a series of meadows filled with wildflowers, Indian paintbrush, lupine, mountain aster, and dozens of species Emily couldn't identify. Each meadow offered views of their destination lake, which appeared and disappeared between stands of trees as they descended. The lake itself was larger than Emily had expected, perhaps 1/2 mile long and 1/4 mile wide, surrounded by peaks that rose directly from the water's edge. As they got closer, they could see that the lake had several distinct areas that would offer different camping experiences. The northern shore was rocky and exposed, with dramatic views but little shelter from weather. The southern shore was more forested, offering protection from wind and rain, but fewer scenic vistas. The eastern end of the lake featured a small beach area and what appeared to be the remains of an old cabin or shelter, while the western end was dominated by the massive waterfall that fed the lake from glacial fields thousands of feet above. Their designated campsite, B47, was located on the southern shore, roughly halfway between the eastern and western ends of the lake. As they approached the area, Emily felt her excitement building to an almost unbearable level. This was going to be their home for the next 4 nights, their private wilderness paradise where they would sleep under the stars, cook over their camp stove, and spend their first extended time as a married couple with no distractions from the outside world. The campsite itself exceeded every expectation Emily had developed during months of planning. It was situated on a small rise about 50 yards back from the lakeshore, offering both privacy and spectacular views while providing protection from potential flooding or extreme weather. The camping area was a natural clearing roughly 30 feet in diameter, surrounded by mature subalpine firs that would provide windbreak and visual screening. Previous campers had created a fire ring from local stones, though current fire restrictions meant they wouldn't be able to use it during their stay. A small stream ran along the eastern edge of the clearing, providing a convenient source of fresh water for drinking, cooking, and washing. The stream was fed by snowmelt and springs, running clear and cold even in the warmth of the June afternoon. Emily knelt beside it and cupped the water in her hands, tasting the pure, mineral-free flavor that could only come from high-elevation sources. Jacob immediately began the systematic process of setting up their temporary home, his engineer's mind working through the logical sequence of tasks that would need to be completed before dark. First priority was shelter, selecting the best location for their tent within the designated camping area, considering factors like drainage, wind protection, ground conditions, and morning sun exposure. He chose a slightly elevated spot near the center of the clearing that offered level ground, good drainage, and natural wind protection from the surrounding trees. Emily busied herself with exploring their immediate surroundings, taking photographs of everything and creating what she privately thought of as their homestead documentation. She photographed the view from their tent site, the stream that would provide their water, the fire ring they couldn't use, the trees that surrounded them, and the trail access to their camp. Her camera captured details that would later prove important: the layout of the campsite, the proximity of the forest, the multiple game trails that converged near their location, and the dense undergrowth that could conceal approaching wildlife. Setting up their tent proved to be more challenging than expected due to the rocky ground and the need to clear away pine cones, fallen branches, and other natural debris. Their shelter was a high-quality three-season model designed for alpine conditions, a freestanding dome design that could handle strong winds and moderate precipitation. The tent featured a full rainfly, vestibule for gear storage, and interior space that could accommodate 2 people plus their essential gear. Jacob had just finished staking out the guy lines when Emily called his attention to something that would later seem significant. "Jake, come look at this," she called from the edge of the clearing where she was photographing wildflowers. "There are some really interesting animal tracks over here." The tracks were in a patch of soft earth beside the stream, where the ground stayed moist even during dry weather. Emily had photographed them, with a trekking pole placed alongside for scale, clearly showing the size and shape of what appeared to be large paw prints. The tracks showed 4 toes, with claw marks extending well beyond the toe pads, and the largest prints measured nearly 6 inches from heel to toe. Jacob studied the tracks carefully, drawing on his limited knowledge of wildlife tracking gained from previous camping trips and wilderness safety courses. "They look like bear tracks," he said finally, "but they're bigger than any black bear prints I've seen before. Could be an unusually large black bear, or possibly." He trailed off, not wanting to voice his concern about grizzly bears. Emily seemed more fascinated than worried. "They're beautiful, aren't they? Look at how clear the claw marks are, and you can even see the pad texture in this one." She took several more photos from different angles, unconsciously creating documentation that would later be studied intensively by wildlife investigators. "When do you think they were made?" Jacob asked, examining the condition of the track edges and looking for signs of recent rainfall or other factors that might indicate age. "Hard to tell exactly," Emily replied, "but the edges are still pretty sharp, and we haven't had any rain in the past couple of days, according to the weather forecast. Maybe yesterday, or even this morning early. Jacob felt a small chill at the possibility that a large bear had visited their campsite area recently, but he forced himself to remain rational about the situation. Bears were common throughout the Canadian Rockies, and finding tracks near a backcountry campsite was neither unusual nor necessarily cause for concern. They had prepared for the possibility of bear encounters by bringing bear spray, following proper food storage protocols, and educating themselves about appropriate response techniques. We'll just need to be extra careful about keeping a clean camp and storing our food properly, he said, as much to reassure himself as Emily. The bear canisters should keep our food safe, and we've got bear spray if we need it. Emily nodded agreement, though her mind was already moving on to other aspects of setting up their temporary home. She had been looking forward to this camping experience for months, and she wasn't about to let worry about wildlife dampen her enthusiasm. Besides, they were both experienced hikers who understood wilderness safety protocols. The statistical likelihood of a dangerous bear encounter remained extremely small, especially for prepared campers who followed established guidelines. The remainder of the afternoon was spent in the domestic tasks of backcountry camping, organizing their gear, setting up their cooking area, filtering water from the stream, and preparing for their first night in the wilderness. Jacob rigged their food storage system according to park regulations, placing all scented items, including food, toiletries, soap, and garbage, into bear-proof canisters that he positioned at least 100 yards from their tent and elevated off the ground using the cable system provided by the park service. Emily established their camp kitchen in a flat area near the stream, organizing their lightweight stove, cooking pot, eating utensils, and water filtration system on a small tarp that would make cleanup easier. Their meals for the trip had been carefully planned to provide adequate nutrition while minimizing weight and packaging. Tonight's dinner would be freeze-dried chili mac with added protein powder, supplemented by energy bars, dried fruit, and hot chocolate made with powdered milk. As the afternoon wore on, they settled into the rhythms of camp life with the easy compatibility that came from 3 years of shared wilderness experiences. Emily worked on updating her trip journal, writing detailed descriptions of their hike, the campsite, and her impressions of their first day as married wilderness adventurers. Jacob organized their gear and checked the weather forecast on his satellite communicator, confirming that the next several days would offer ideal conditions for hiking and camping. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks when they heard voices approaching on the trail from the direction they had come. Emily looked up from her journal with interest. They had been hoping for solitude, but she was also curious about who else might be visiting this remote area. The voices belonged to a group of 4-day hikers from Calgary who had started before dawn, with the ambitious goal of reaching the lake and returning to the trailhead in a single day. The group was led by Michael Zhang, a 40-something accountant and serious amateur photographer who made regular trips to remote locations throughout the Canadian Rockies. He carried an expensive digital camera system and had hiked more than 25 miles to reach this lake purely for the opportunity to photograph it during the golden hour just before sunset. His companions were his brother David Zhang, his longtime hiking partner Jennifer Walsh, and Jennifer's teenage daughter Casey, who was developing her own interest in wilderness photography. "Beautiful spot you've chosen," Michael observed, as the group paused near Jacob and Emily's campsite to rest and hydrate before beginning their photography session. "We've been planning this shot for months, waiting for the right combination of weather, wildflower bloom, and available time off work." Emily invited them to sit and share the view from their camp, and the conversation that followed provided a welcome social break from their honeymoon solitude. The day hikers were experienced wilderness travelers who appreciated the effort required to carry full camping equipment to this remote location, and they shared information about trail conditions, weather patterns, and wildlife observations from their journey. "We saw quite a bit of wildlife on the way up," Jennifer Walsh mentioned as she helped her daughter set up a tripod for long-exposure photography. "Lots of marmots and pikas in the rock fields, a small herd of mountain goats on the cliffs near the pass, and some interesting bear sign along the trail about 2 miles below here." Casey Walsh, 17 years old and passionate about wildlife photography, looked up from her camera setup with interest. "Mum saw some really fresh-looking tracks in that muddy area where the trail crosses the creek. They looked huge compared to the black bear tracks we've seen before." "How fresh?" Jacob asked, his engineer's mind automatically processing this new information and comparing it to their earlier discovery of tracks near their own campsite. "Maybe this morning, or possibly even more recent," Michael Zhang replied, after conferring quietly with his brother. "The edges were really sharp, and there was no debris blown into them. Plus, there was what looked like fresh scat maybe 50 yards further up the trail, dark-colored, full of berry seeds and other vegetation." Emily felt a small flutter of unease, though she continued to tell herself that bear activity was normal and expected in wilderness areas. The fact that multiple groups had now observed fresh bear sign in the vicinity of their campsite area was noteworthy, but it didn't necessarily indicate any immediate danger. Bears were generally more afraid of humans than humans were of bears, and most encounters resulted in the bear retreating as soon as it detected human presence. The photography session that followed provided a welcome distraction from thoughts about wildlife. Michael and Casey Zhang worked systematically to capture the lake during the golden hour, when warm light painted the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and orange, while the water reflected the colors like a perfect mirror. Emily borrowed some composition ideas for her own photography, learning from Michael's experience and technical knowledge about mountain landscape photography. As the sun sank lower toward the western peaks, the day hikers began preparing for their return journey to the trailhead. Their plan was to hike out by headlamp, reaching the parking area sometime after midnight. It was an ambitious undertaking that required excellent physical conditioning and extensive experience with nighttime wilderness travel, but all 4 group members seemed comfortable with the challenge. "You folks have a wonderful honeymoon," Jennifer Walsh said, as the group shouldered their day packs and prepared to leave. "This is one of the most magical places in the entire park system. You're going to have memories from this trip that last a lifetime." Casey Walsh, with the impulsive generosity of a teenager, gave Emily a small gift, a hand-carved wooden whistle that her grandfather had made for her. "It's for emergencies," she explained. "My grandpa always said that a whistle carries further than a human voice and doesn't get tired like shouting does. I've got others, so please keep this one." Emily was touched by the gesture and promised to treasure the whistle as a memento of their honeymoon adventure. She tucked it into the chest pocket of her hiking shirt, where it would remain throughout the events that followed. The whistle would later be found by search teams, damaged but still functional, nearly half a mile from their campsite. As the day hikers disappeared down the trail, with their headlamps bobbing through the twilight forest, Jacob and Emily found themselves alone in their wilderness paradise for the first time since their arrival. The silence was profound. No traffic, no machinery, no human voices except their own. The only sounds were natural ones, the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore, the whisper of wind through the trees, the occasional call of a loon from somewhere across the water, and the constant background murmur of the stream that ran past their camp. Emily stood at the edge of their camping area and slowly turned in a complete circle, taking in every detail of their surroundings in the fading light. The peaks around them were beginning to glow with alpenglow, that magical phenomenon where snow-covered summits appear to emit their own warm light for a brief period after sunset. The lake surface was mirror calm, creating perfect reflections of the mountains and the deepening blue sky above. "This is perfect," she said quietly, more to herself than to Jacob. "This is exactly what I hoped our honeymoon would be like. Just us, and all of this incredible beauty, and nothing else in the world that matters." Jacob joined her at the edge of the clearing, slipping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. They stood together in comfortable silence as the light faded and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the peaks. The air temperature was dropping rapidly with the loss of solar heating, reminding them that even June nights at this elevation could be quite cold. "We should probably start thinking about dinner," Jacob said eventually, though neither of them wanted to break the spell of the moment. "And we need to get organized for the night while we can still see what we're doing." Preparing dinner became a cozy domestic ritual that emphasized their new status as a married couple sharing their first major adventure together. Emily worked on rehydrating their freeze-dried chili mac, while Jacob organized their eating utensils and prepared hot drinks on their camp stove. The simple meal tasted like gourmet cuisine when eaten in such spectacular surroundings, and they lingered over dinner much longer than necessary, talking quietly about their hopes for the rest of the trip and their life together in general. As full darkness settled over the mountains, they retreated to their tent for warmth and protection from the increasing cold. Their sleeping system consisted of high-quality down sleeping bags rated to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, sleeping pads for insulation from the ground, and pillows made from stuff sacks filled with extra clothing. Inside the tent, they were warm and comfortable, despite the near-freezing temperatures outside. Emily lay awake for a long time after Jacob fell asleep, listening to the sounds of the wilderness night and marveling at their situation. 6 months ago, she had been single and living in a downtown Denver apartment with 2 roommates and a view of a parking lot. Now she was married to her best friend and adventure partner, lying in a tent beside a pristine alpine lake in one of the world's most beautiful wilderness areas, with 4 more days of exploration and discovery ahead of them. The night sounds were entirely different from anything she had experienced during their previous camping trips, which had mostly been in more accessible areas with higher levels of human activity. Here, the wilderness felt truly wild and untouched. She heard the haunting call of wolves echoing from somewhere across the lake, the splash of what might have been a beaver or muskrat in the shallows, and various rustling and movement sounds from the forest around their campsite. Around midnight, Emily was wakened from light sleep by a sound she couldn't immediately identify. A low rumbling or huffing noise that seemed to come from somewhere near their camp. She lay perfectly still, listening intently and trying to determine whether the sound was natural or something she should be concerned about. Jacob continued sleeping peacefully beside her, his breathing deep and regular. The sound came again, closer this time, and accompanied by what might have been the soft pad of large feet moving through the forest debris around their campsite. Emily's heart began to beat faster as she realized they might have a large animal investigating their camp. She reached carefully for the bear spray that they kept inside the tent vestibule, moving slowly to avoid making noise that might alert whatever was outside to their presence. For nearly 20 minutes, she lay awake, listening to periodic sounds of movement around their campsite. At one point, she was almost certain she heard sniffing sounds near the area where Jacob had positioned their bear canisters, suggesting that their nocturnal visitor was investigating their food storage system. The sounds gradually moved away toward the lakeshore, and eventually Emily drifted back to sleep, convinced that a curious bear had checked out their camp and moved on without finding anything of interest. She never woke Jacob to tell him about the nighttime visitor, a decision she would later regret during the long hours of trauma counseling that followed their rescue. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a normal wilderness experience, the kind of wildlife encounter that added excitement to a camping trip without creating any real danger. Bears investigated campsites all the time, found nothing accessible, and went about their business. There was no reason to alarm Jacob or to worry about something that appeared to have resolved itself peacefully. The second day of their honeymoon dawned clear and crisp, with frost coating their tent rainfly and the surrounding vegetation. Emily woke first, as she usually did when camping, and lay quietly in her sleeping bag, watching condensation from their breath create patterns of ice crystals on the inside of the tent. The air was cold enough that she could see her breath, but their sleeping bags and the warmth generated by their bodies had kept them comfortable throughout the night. Jacob stirred as the first rays of sunlight struck their tent, automatically reaching for Emily and pulling her close in the unconscious gesture of a man who had already adapted to married life. They lay together in sleepy contentment for several minutes, listening to the morning sounds of the wilderness awakening around them. Birds began calling from the forest, a loon cried from somewhere across the lake, and they could hear the gentle splash of what might have been a fish jumping in the still water. "Good morning, Mrs. Harris," Jacob murmured against Emily's hair, his voice thick with sleep and happiness. "How did you sleep in our honeymoon suite?" Emily stretched luxuriously within the confines of her sleeping bag, every muscle in her body pleasantly tired from the previous day's hike. "Like a queen in her castle," she replied, though she decided not to mention her middle-of-the-night wildlife encounter. "I think I could get used to waking up in paradise with my husband." The morning routine of breaking camp began with the tasks necessary for survival and comfort in the wilderness. Jacob started their camp stove to boil water for coffee and oatmeal, while Emily organized their clothes for the day and began the process of stuffing their sleeping bags back into their compression sacks. The air temperature was probably in the low 30s, cold enough to make every task slightly more challenging and to emphasize the importance of staying warm and dry. Emily's planned outfit for the day reflected her careful preparation for variable mountain weather conditions. She chose merino wool base layers that would regulate her body temperature and wick moisture away from her skin, followed by a lightweight fleece jacket for insulation and a windbreaker that could be removed or added as conditions changed. Her hiking pants were made from stretchy synthetic fabric that would dry quickly if they got wet, and her boots were the same proven pair she had worn during hundreds of miles of previous hiking. As Jacob worked on breakfast preparation, Emily took her morning photography walk around their immediate campsite area. The early light was perfect for capturing the details that would help them remember this place for the rest of their lives. The view across the lake with mist rising from the water, the surrounding peaks catching the first rays of sunshine, their tent nestled among the trees, and the stream that provided their water source, sparkling in the morning light. It was during this photography session that Emily made a discovery that should have been more alarming than it seemed at the time. Near the area where Jacob had placed their bear canisters, she found clear evidence that their nighttime visitor had been much larger and more persistent than she had realized. The bear canisters themselves were undamaged, their design made them virtually indestructible, but the ground around them showed extensive signs of investigation. Large paw prints in the soft earth indicated that a substantial bear had spent considerable time and effort trying to access their food. The bear had apparently rolled the canisters around, pawed at them extensively, and even attempted to carry one of them a short distance before giving up. Most concerning were the claw marks on a nearby tree trunk, gouged into the bark at a height that suggested an animal much larger than a typical black bear. Emily photographed the evidence carefully, partly for documentation and partly because she found the signs of wildlife activity fascinating rather than frightening. Her photos clearly showed the size of the paw prints, the extent of the disturbance around their food storage area, and the impressive claw marks on the tree. These images would later be studied intensively by wildlife biologists, trying to understand the behavior of the animal that ultimately attacked them. When she returned to camp with her camera, Jacob was already heating water for their morning coffee and setting out the ingredients for breakfast. Their meal would be instant oatmeal supplemented with dried fruit, nuts, and protein powder. Simple fare that provided the calories and nutrition needed for an active day in the mountains. Emily showed him the photos she had taken of the bear evidence, and they discussed what the signs might indicate about their visitor. "Looks like we had quite a thorough investigation last night," Jacob observed, studying the images on Emily's camera display. "The food storage system worked exactly as designed, though. The bear couldn't access anything, got frustrated, and eventually moved on. That's exactly what's supposed to happen." Emily nodded agreement, though she was privately impressed by the size of the track. And the apparent determination the bear had shown in its attempts to access their food. "Do you think it was a black bear, or possibly a grizzly? Some of those prints look pretty large." Jacob compared the photos to the wildlife identification materials they had brought on the trip, but the images weren't clear enough to make a definitive determination. "Hard to say for certain. Could be a large black bear, or maybe a smaller grizzly. The important thing is that our precautions worked. The bear couldn't get to our food, so there's no reason for it to associate our camp with an easy meal." Their breakfast conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another hiking party. Two women from Edmonton named Sarah Mackenzie and Rebecca Thompson, both in their early 30s and apparently experienced wilderness travelers. They were carrying lightweight day packs and moving at a rapid pace that suggested they were on a longer circuit hike rather than car camping like most visitors to the area. Sarah Mackenzie introduced herself as a paramedic with Alberta Health Services, who specialized in wilderness emergency medicine. She was compact and athletic, with short brown hair and the kind of deep tan that suggested extensive time spent outdoors. Her hiking partner, Rebecca Thompson, worked as a wildlife biologist for Alberta Parks and was conducting informal research on backcountry animal populations during her vacation time. "Mind if we join you for a few minutes?" Sarah asked as they approached Jacob and Emily's camp. "We've been hiking since before dawn, and this looks like a perfect spot to rest and refuel before our next push." Emily immediately invited them to share their campsite area, curious about other people's wilderness experiences and always happy to meet fellow outdoor enthusiasts. The conversation that followed would later prove to be crucial in understanding the events that led to the attack, though at the time it seemed like nothing more than the friendly exchange of information that was common among backcountry travelers. Rebecca Thompson's professional interest was immediately captured by Emily's photos of the bear sign from the previous night. As a wildlife biologist, she had extensive experience interpreting animal tracks, scat, and other evidence of wildlife activity. Her analysis of the photographic evidence was more detailed and concerning than anything Jacob and Emily had considered. "These are definitely grizzly bear tracks," Rebecca said after studying the images carefully. "The claw length, pad shape, and overall size are all consistent with a mature male grizzly, probably in the 400 to 500-pound range. That's a substantial animal, and the behavior you're describing suggests it's quite bold around humans." Emily felt a chill of apprehension, though she tried to maintain her enthusiasm for their honeymoon adventure. "Is that something we should be worried about? We followed all the proper food storage protocols, and the bear wasn't able to access anything." Rebecca chose her words carefully, not wanting to spoil their honeymoon, but also aware of her professional responsibility to provide accurate information about wildlife risks. Grizzly bears that spend significant time investigating human campsites are always a concern, especially when they show the kind of persistence your photos indicate. Most bears will give up quickly when they can't access food, but this one apparently invested considerable time and effort in trying to get into your canisters. Sarah Mackenzie nodded agreement, her paramedic training making her naturally cautious about potential emergency situations in remote locations. The other concern is that you're several hours from help if something does go wrong. Our radio doesn't work reliably this far back in the mountains, and even satellite emergency beacons can take hours for rescue teams to respond to. Jacob felt his protective instincts engaging as he processed this new information. The statistical likelihood of a dangerous bear encounter was still extremely small, but the stakes were high enough that even small risks deserved serious consideration. He looked at Emily, trying to gauge her reaction and determine whether they should consider modifying their honeymoon plans. Emily was clearly torn between her desire to continue their planned adventure and a growing awareness that they might be dealing with a more serious wildlife situation than they had initially realized. "What would you recommend?" she asked Rebecca. "Should we consider moving to a different campsite, or is this just normal bear activity that we need to live with?" Rebecca Thompson had been conducting wildlife research in the Canadian Rockies for over a decade, and her experience had taught her to take grizzly bear encounters seriously, especially when the bears showed bold behavior around humans. "If it were me," she said carefully, "I would probably consider relocating to a campsite with more human traffic, or possibly even cutting the trip short and returning to front country camping. A persistent grizzly bear is not something you want to mess around with, especially when you're this far from help." The conversation continued for nearly an hour as the four of them discussed wildlife safety, emergency preparedness, and the balance between reasonable caution and excessive worry. Sarah and Rebecca shared stories from their professional experience with wilderness emergencies, including several bear encounters that had required medical treatment or evacuation. Their perspective was sobering, but it was also informed by years of working in situations where small problems could quickly become life-threatening emergencies. Eventually, Sarah and Rebecca prepared to continue their own hiking adventure, leaving Jacob and Emily to discuss what they had learned and decide how to proceed with their honeymoon plans. The two women provided their contact information and made Jacob and Emily promise to check in with them when they returned to civilization, offering to assist with any problems that might arise during the remainder of their trip. "Please be extra careful," Rebecca said as they shouldered their packs and prepared to leave. "Trust your instincts, make noise when you're moving around camp, and don't hesitate to use your bear spray if you feel threatened. Most bear encounters end peacefully, but the ones that don't can deteriorate very rapidly." After Sarah and Rebecca disappeared up the trail toward their next destination, Jacob and Emily sat beside their camp stove in thoughtful silence. The morning that had begun with such joy and anticipation now felt complicated by concerns about their safety and questions about whether they should continue their planned honeymoon adventure. Emily stared across the lake at the surrounding peaks, trying to balance her desire to experience this incredible place with the growing realization that they might be facing genuine risks. "What do you think we should do?" Emily asked finally, though part of her already knew what Jacob's engineer mind would conclude. He was naturally cautious and methodical, more likely to err on the side of safety than to take unnecessary risks, especially when his wife's welfare was involved. Jacob had been thinking through the same questions, weighing the likelihood of danger against the importance of this trip to their marriage and their shared love of wilderness adventure. "I think we should be very careful and very prepared," he said finally. "But I don't think we need to panic or abandon our honeymoon. We've got bear spray, we know proper safety protocols, and we're only planning to be here for 4 more days. The odds are still very much in our favor." Emily felt relief flood through her at Jacob's measured response. She had been worried that he would want to pack up immediately and return to the relative safety of front country camping, cutting short their carefully planned wilderness honeymoon. "So we stay, but we're extra cautious about everything. Keep the bear spray handy, make lots of noise, stay alert for any signs of bear activity." "Exactly," Jacob confirmed. "We follow all the safety protocols religiously. We stay aware of our surroundings, and we enjoy this incredible place that we've worked so hard to reach. But we also stay flexible about cutting the trip short if the situation changes, or if we encounter any more concerning evidence of bear activity." Undut, their decision made, they spent the remainder of the morning organizing their camp and preparing for a day hike to explore the area around their lakeside base camp. Emily's excitement began to return as they planned their route, consulted topographic maps, and packed day packs with the supplies they would need for several hours of hiking. The bear encounter from the previous night began to seem like just one more wilderness experience to add to their collection of adventure stories. Their planned day hike would take them around the eastern end of the lake and up a tributary valley to a series of smaller alpine lakes that their topographic map indicated would be incredibly scenic. The route was unmarked and required navigation skills, map reading, and the kind of route-finding experience that both Jacob and Emily had developed during their years of wilderness travel together. It was exactly the kind of adventure they had envisioned when they decided to spend their honeymoon in the backcountry rather than at a beach resort. As they prepared to leave camp for their day hike, Emily made one final check of their campsite to ensure that everything was properly secured and stored according to bear safety protocols. All food, toiletries, and scented items were locked in their bear canisters and positioned well away from their tent. Their campsite was clean and free of any materials that might attract wildlife. Their tent was zipped closed to prevent curious animals from investigating their personal belongings. Jacob strapped their bear spray to the hip belt of his day pack, where it would be immediately accessible if needed. They had practiced deploying the spray during their pre-trip preparation, learning how to remove the safety clip and aim the device effectively. The spray had a range of approximately 30 feet and would create a cloud of capsaicin-based irritant that would deter most bears, though it was not guaranteed to stop a determined attacker. Their day pack also contained emergency supplies, including first aid materials, emergency shelter, extra food and water, navigation tools, and Emily's satellite communicator that could summon help if they encountered serious problems. They were prepared for the possibility of getting lost, injured, or trapped by weather changes, though they expected none of these scenarios to develop during their planned 8-hour circuit hike. The trail around the eastern end of the lake was faint but followable, marked by occasional cairns left by previous hikers and by the natural line of least resistance through the terrain. Emily led the way, her natural enthusiasm for exploration making her eager to discover what lay around each bend in the shoreline. Jacob followed close behind, his attention divided between enjoying the spectacular scenery and maintaining awareness of their surroundings for potential wildlife encounters. The lake was even more beautiful when viewed from different angles and elevations. The water was incredibly clear, allowing them to see large trout swimming in the shallows and to observe the rocky bottom dropping away into deep blue depths in the center. The surrounding peaks were reflected perfectly in the still surface, creating a mirror world that seemed to double the majesty of the already impressive landscape. They stopped frequently for photography and simply to absorb the incredible beauty surrounding them. Emily's camera captured images that would later become treasured memories of their honeymoon adventure. Jacob silhouetted against the dramatic mountain backdrop, wide shots of the lake that showed its incredible setting, close-up photos of wildflowers and interesting rock formations, and self-portraits of the two of them together in paradise. As they rounded the eastern end of the lake and began following the tributary stream toward the upper lakes, they entered increasingly wild and remote territory. The trail became even fainter, sometimes disappearing entirely in areas where they had to navigate by following the stream course or choosing the most logical route through the terrain. This was the kind of wilderness travel that both of them loved, challenging enough to be engaging, but not so difficult as to be dangerous for experienced hikers. The tributary valley was a perfect example of glacial carving, with steep walls rising directly from the stream course and evidence of ancient ice movement visible in the polished rock surfaces and U-shaped profile. Waterfalls cascaded down the valley walls from hanging glaciers thousands of feet above, creating a constant sound of moving water that masked other noises and made conversation necessary at close range. It was in this environment of reduced visibility and ambient noise that they had their first direct encounter with the bear that had investigated their campsite the previous night, though at the time they had no way of knowing it was the same animal. The encounter occurred at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, as they were navigating around a large boulder that blocked the faint trail about 3 miles from their base camp. Emily was in the lead when she stopped suddenly and held up her hand to signal Jacob to freeze. About 50 yards ahead, a large brown bear was standing in the stream, apparently fishing for trout in a deep pool below a small waterfall. The bear was enormous, easily the largest wild animal either of them had ever seen, with a massive shoulder hump and thick brown fur that identified it as an adult male grizzly bear. For several long moments, none of the three animals moved. Emily and Jacob stood frozen beside the boulder, afraid to advance or retreat for fear of triggering a chase response from the bear. The grizzly continued fishing, apparently unaware of their presence due to the wind direction and the sound of the waterfall masking any noise they might have made. Emily slowly reached for her camera, moving with the deliberate care of someone who understood that sudden movements could be dangerous. The photographs she took during the next few minutes would later be studied extensively by wildlife biologists, trying to understand the behavior of the bear that ultimately attacked their campsite. The images clearly showed a mature male grizzly bear, probably weighing between 400 and 500 pounds, with no visible injuries or abnormalities that might explain unusually aggressive behavior. The bear appeared healthy, well-fed, and engaged in normal fishing behavior. Jacob slowly reached for the bear spray on his hip belt, though he was careful not to make any sudden movements that might attract the animal's attention. Their safety training had emphasized that most bear encounters ended peacefully if humans remained calm and avoided threatening behavior. The recommended response was to wait for the bear to move away naturally, then retreat carefully while making noise to avoid surprising the animal in the future. For nearly 15 minutes, they watched the grizzly bear fish in the stream below the waterfall. The animal was remarkably graceful, despite its massive size, moving through the water with fluid motions and occasionally catching trout with lightning-fast paw strikes. Emily found herself fascinated by the bear's behavior and impressed by its obvious intelligence and capability as a predator. Eventually, the bear caught a large trout and moved to the opposite bank to consume its meal, providing Emily and Jacob with an opportunity to retreat carefully without confronting the animal directly. They backed away slowly, making no sudden movements and avoiding eye contact that might be interpreted as a challenge. Once they were several hundred yards away and behind screening vegetation, they turned and hiked rapidly back toward their base camp, their hearts pounding with adrenaline from the encounter. "That was incredible," Emily said once they were safely away from the bear and hiking back toward their campsite. "Did you see the size of that animal? It was like something out of a nature documentary. And those fishing skills. I've never seen anything like that outside of a television program." Jacob was feeling a complex mixture of excitement from the wildlife encounter and concern about their safety situation. That was definitely a mature male grizzly, probably the same one that investigated our campsite last night. The size matches the tracks we found, and there probably aren't multiple grizzlies in this immediate area. Emily stopped walking and turned to face Jacob, suddenly realizing the implications of what he was saying. "You think that was our nighttime visitor? The same bear that was trying to get into our food canisters?" "I'd bet money on it," Jacob replied. "The size, the location, the timing, it all fits, which means we've now had 2 encounters with the same bear in less than 24 hours. That's probably not a coincidence, especially since this isn't exactly prime grizzly habitat. This bear might be specifically focused on our area for some reason." The hike back to their campsite was subdued as both Emily and Jacob processed the implications of their bear encounter. What had started as a minor concern about wildlife safety was beginning to feel like a more serious situation that might require them to reconsider their honeymoon plans. Emily's excitement about their wilderness adventure was beginning to be tempered by realistic concerns about their safety in an increasingly complex situation. When they reached their campsite in late afternoon, they found evidence of another visit from their ursine neighbor. The bear canisters had been moved again, though not as extensively as the previous night, and there were fresh tracks in the soft earth around their camping area. Most concerning was a new set of claw marks on a tree directly adjacent to their tent site, gouges in the bark that had definitely not been present when they left camp that morning. Emily stared at the fresh claw marks with growing unease, finally beginning to appreciate the seriousness of their situation. "It came back while we were gone," she said quietly, "and it was much closer to our tent this time. Those claw marks are maybe 10 feet from where we sleep." Jacob examined the evidence carefully, his engineer's mind working through the implications of what they were observing. "This bear is definitely focused on our campsite specifically. It's made at least 3 visits in 36 hours, and it's becoming bolder about approaching our immediate camping area. That's not normal behavior for a wild grizzly bear." They spent the remainder of the afternoon discussing their options and trying to decide whether their situation had crossed the line from acceptable risk to genuine danger. Emily was reluctant to abandon their carefully planned honeymoon adventure, but she was also beginning to understand that they might be dealing with a bear that posed a real threat to their safety. "What if we try one more night?" Emily suggested. "We keep the bear spray right beside our sleeping bags, we take turns staying awake to watch for any signs of the bear, and if there's any more activity, we pack up first thing in the morning and head back to the trailhead." Jacob considered her proposal, weighing their desire to continue their honeymoon against his growing concern for their safety. "One more night, with a specific plan for what we do if the bear shows up again. We agree right now that if we have any direct contact with the bear around our camp, we immediately prepare to leave. No discussion, no trying to rationalize why it might be safe to stay." Emily agreed to Jacob's terms, though part of her was still hoping that their situation would resolve itself peacefully. Bears were naturally shy around humans, and most experts agreed that persistent bears usually moved on when they couldn't find food rewards. Their situation was unusual, but not necessarily dangerous, especially if they remained vigilant and prepared to respond appropriately to any threatening behavior. They spent the evening hours organizing their gear for a possible early departure, reviewing their emergency response procedures, and preparing a dinner that could be eaten quickly if necessary. The bear spray was moved inside their tent where it would be immediately accessible, and Jacob rigged their satellite communicator to send an automatic distress signal if activated quickly in an emergency situation. As darkness fell over their campsite for the second night, Emily and Jacob settled into their tent with considerably more anxiety than they had felt 24 hours earlier. Emily lay awake, listening to every sound from the surrounding forest, trying to distinguish between normal wilderness noises and potential signs of their ursine visitor. Jacob dozed fitfully, waking at regular intervals to listen for sounds of bear activity around their camp. Around 11:30 p.m., their worst fears were realized when they heard the unmistakable sounds of a large animal moving through their campsite area. This time, the bear was not being subtle about its investigation. They could hear heavy footsteps, snuffling sounds, and what appeared to be the bear pawing at their tent guy lines and stakes. Emily reached for the bear spray with trembling hands, while Jacob quietly activated their satellite emergency beacon, though he knew it would be hours before rescue teams could respond to their remote location. The bear's investigation of their campsite was much more aggressive than previous visits. They could hear it moving around their tent, apparently trying to determine how to access the interior where they lay terrified in their sleeping bags. At one point, the tent fabric bulged inward as something large pressed against the outside wall, and Emily had to bite her lip to keep from crying out in fear. For nearly 30 minutes, the bear continued its investigation of their campsite, while Emily and Jacob lay frozen in their tent, afraid to move or make any sound that might trigger an attack. They could hear the animals breathing, the scrape of claws against the tent fabric, and occasionally a low rumbling sound that might have been a growl or simply the bear's normal vocalizations. Eventually, the sounds began to move away from their immediate tent area, and they heard the bear investigating other parts of their campsite: the fire ring, the stream bank, the area where they had been cooking earlier. Emily began to hope that the animal would once again lose interest and move away into the forest, allowing them to survive another night and make their escape at first light. But this night was different from the previous one. Instead of moving away and disappearing into the wilderness, the bear seemed to settle down somewhere near their campsite, as if it had decided to stay in the area rather than continuing its usual nocturnal wanderings. They could hear periodic sounds of movement and the occasional snapping of twigs, but the animal remained close by, rather than departing, as it had the night before. Neither Emily nor Jacob slept during the remaining hours of darkness. They lay in their sleeping bags, fully clothed, with boots on their feet and bear spray in their hands, listening to the sounds of their uninvited neighbor and trying to prepare mentally for whatever might happen when daylight returned. Emily found herself thinking about their families back in Colorado, wondering if they would ever see them again, and regretting that she had insisted on this remote wilderness honeymoon. Dawn came slowly on June 12th, their third day in the wilderness, and what would prove to be their last full day together as an intact married couple. The bear sounds had gradually diminished during the pre-dawn hours, and by the time the first grey light began to filter through their tent walls, the forest around their campsite had returned to its normal pattern of bird calls and small animal activity. Jacob was the first to venture outside the tent, moving carefully and making noise to announce his presence to any wildlife that might still be in the area. The campsite showed extensive evidence of the bear's nighttime activities. Their cooking area had been thoroughly investigated. Several trees bore fresh claw marks, and the ground around their tent was covered with large paw prints that told the story of the animal's systematic exploration of their temporary home. Emily joined Jacob outside the tent as soon as he confirmed that the bear was no longer in their immediate vicinity. Her face was pale with exhaustion and stress from the sleepless night, and she moved with the careful precision of someone who expected danger to materialize at any moment. The magic and wonder of their wilderness honeymoon had been completely overshadowed by fear and the growing realization that they were facing a genuinely dangerous situation. "We need to pack up and get out of here," Jacob said without preamble, his decision-making process simplified by the events of the previous night. "This bear is not going to leave us alone, and we're too far from help if something goes wrong. Our honeymoon adventure just became a survival situation." Emily nodded agreement, though part of her felt heartbroken at the thought of abandoning the beautiful campsite where they had planned to spend 4 more romantic nights under the stars. "How long do you think it will take us to pack up and hike out?" she asked, already beginning to stuff their sleeping bags into compression sacks. Jacob was calculating distances, elevation changes, and their probable hiking speed while carrying full packs under stress conditions. "If we move fast and don't take extended breaks, we can probably make the trailhead by mid-afternoon. Maybe 6 or 7 hours of hard hiking, assuming we don't run into any problems along the way." The packing process that had taken them nearly 2 hours to complete when they arrived now proceeded with desperate efficiency. Emily organized their personal belongings while Jacob dealt with their shelter system and cooking equipment. Every few minutes, one of them would stop and listen for sounds of the bear returning, but the forest around their campsite remained quiet, except for normal wildlife activity. As Jacob was collapsing their tent and rolling it into its stuff sack, Emily made a final photographic circuit of their campsite, documenting the bear evidence and capturing images of the place where their honeymoon adventure had taken such a dramatic turn. Her photos from that morning clearly showed the extent of the bear's investigation: claw marks on multiple trees, disturbed earth around their camping area, and the systematic way the animal had explored every aspect of their temporary home. They were nearly finished packing when they heard voices approaching from the direction of the trail, other hikers heading toward the lake area who had no idea they were walking into a potentially dangerous situation. Emily felt a surge of relief at the prospect of human company and the possibility that a larger group might deter the bear from returning to their immediate area. The voices belonged to a family of 4 from Vancouver. Parents David and Linda Morrison with their 2 teenage children, 16-year-old Tyler and 14-year-old Emma. They were experienced hikers who had been visiting the Canadian Rockies for summer vacations since their children were small, and they carried the confident bearing of people who felt completely at home in wilderness settings. David Morrison was a high school geography teacher with an extensive knowledge of local geology and natural history, while his wife Linda worked as a nurse and brought valuable medical skills to their family adventures. Tyler was developing into a serious wilderness photographer like his mother, and Emma had inherited her father's interest in natural sciences and was considering studying environmental biology in college. "Beautiful morning for hiking," David called out as the family approached Jacob and Emily's obviously busy packing operation. "You folks getting an early start, or are you heading out already?" Jacob looked up from where he was struggling to compress their tent into its stuff sack, his face showing the strain of their sleepless night and the urgent need to leave their campsite as quickly as possible. "We're actually cutting our trip short," he replied, not wanting to alarm the family, but also feeling obligated to warn them about their bear situation. "We've had some concerning wildlife activity around our camp, and we've decided it's safer to head back to the trailhead." Linda Morrison's nursing background made her immediately attentive to any mention of safety concerns, especially when they involved her family's welfare. "What kind of wildlife activity?" she asked, setting down her pack and moving closer to examine the evidence Emily had been photographing. Emily showed the Morrison family her photos from the previous 3 days, explaining their encounters with bear tracks, the fishing grizzly they had observed during their day hike, and the increasingly bold nighttime investigations of their campsite. The evidence was compelling and concerning, particularly the fresh claw marks on trees immediately adjacent to their camping area. "That's definitely a mature male grizzly," David Morrison observed after studying the photographic evidence. And the behavior you're describing is pretty unusual. Most bears that can't access food will move on to easier opportunities, but this one seems to be specifically focused on your location. Tyler Morrison, with the intense curiosity of a 16-year-old photographer, was fascinated by Emily's images of the bear fishing in the tributary stream. "These photos are incredible," he said, studying the images on Emily's camera display. "Look at the size of that animal, and you can see every detail of its fishing technique." Emma Morrison was more focused on the safety implications of what she was hearing. "Are you sure it's safe for us to camp here if there's a problem bear in the area?" she asked her parents. "Maybe we should consider camping somewhere else, or at least setting up further away from where these folks had their encounters." The conversation that followed was a complex negotiation between the Morrison family's desire to continue their planned vacation and their growing awareness that they might be walking into a genuinely dangerous situation. Emily and Jacob shared everything they knew about the bear's behavior patterns, timing of appearances, and apparent focus on their specific campsite area. "The bear might move on now that we're leaving," Jacob suggested, though his tone indicated he wasn't entirely convinced of this himself. "It seems to be specifically interested in our campsite, so maybe it will follow our scent trail when we hike out and lose interest in this area." David Morrison was studying their topographic map and considering alternative camping locations that might be safer than the area where Jacob and Emily had encountered the persistent bear. "There's another designated campsite about 2 miles further around the lake," he observed. "It's more exposed and probably less scenic, but it might be far enough away to avoid this particular animal." Linda Morrison's medical training made her naturally cautious about situations that could result in serious injuries far from definitive medical care. "How confident are we that this bear's behavior is focused on this specific location rather than on humans in general?" she asked. "If it's just territorial about this particular area, we can camp elsewhere. But if it's lost its fear of humans, we might all be at risk no matter where we set up camp." The discussion continued for nearly 30 minutes as the 6 hikers weighed the available information and tried to make responsible decisions about their respective safety. Emily found herself feeling guilty about potentially ruining another family's vacation plans. But she also knew that sharing information about the bear's behavior was the responsible thing to do. Eventually, the Morrison family decided to continue to the lake area, but to establish their camp at the alternative site David had identified on the map. They would spend one night in the area to see whether the bear activity continued without Jacob and Emily's presence, and they would be prepared to evacuate immediately if they encountered any concerning wildlife behavior. "Please be extra careful," Emily said, as the families prepared to part ways, the Morrisons continuing toward the lake while Jacob and Emily began their urgent hike back to the trailhead. "That bear is much larger and more persistent than anything we expected to encounter. Make sure your food storage is absolutely perfect, and don't hesitate to leave if anything feels wrong." Tyler Morrison gave Emily a small token of appreciation for sharing the bear information, a hand-carved wooden bear figurine that his grandfather had made for him years earlier. "For your adventure scrapbook," he said with the generosity of youth, "something to remember your honeymoon by, even though it didn't turn out exactly as planned." Emily was touched by the gesture and promised to treasure the carving as a reminder of their wilderness adventure and the kindness of fellow hikers who had become part of their story. She tucked the wooden bear into her hip pack, where it would later be found by search teams, and returned to the Morrison family as evidence of their last known contact with other humans. The hike out began with desperate urgency as Jacob and Emily pushed hard to put distance between themselves and the area where they had encountered the persistent grizzly bear. Emily's photography became sporadic and focused primarily on documenting their route and the spectacular scenery they were leaving behind. Jacob concentrated on navigation and maintaining their rapid pace, checking their GPS position regularly and calculating their estimated time of arrival at the trailhead. For the first several miles, they maintained a pace that was significantly faster than their comfortable hiking speed, driven by adrenaline and the desire to reach safety as quickly as possible. Emily's pack felt heavier than it had during their initial hike into the wilderness, loaded down with 5 days' worth of food and equipment that now seemed like unnecessary burden rather than the tools of adventure. The trail conditions were identical to what they had encountered during their hike-in, but their experience of the landscape was completely different. Instead of stopping frequently for photography and conversation, they moved with focused determination toward the safety of the trailhead and their vehicle. The spectacular mountain scenery that had captivated them just 3 days earlier now seemed like a beautiful but dangerous environment where they were unwelcome visitors. Around mid-morning, as they reached the high saddle that marked the approximate halfway point of their return journey, Emily began to experience the physical effects of stress, insufficient sleep, and their demanding pace. She was breathing hard, despite her good physical conditioning, and her legs felt unsteady on the technical sections of trail that required careful foot placement. "I need to slow down a little," Emily said as they paused at a trail junction to confirm their route. "I'm starting to feel shaky, and I don't want to make a mistake that could lead to an injury when we're so close to getting out safely." Jacob immediately agreed to moderate their pace, recognizing that a hiking injury could turn their urgent but manageable evacuation into a genuine emergency situation. "You're right," he said, consulting their map and GPS to confirm their position. "We're making good time, and we can afford to hike at a more sustainable pace for the rest of the way out." The adjustment in pace allowed them to settle into a more comfortable rhythm and to begin processing the emotional impact of their abbreviated honeymoon adventure. Emily found herself feeling disappointed and somewhat embarrassed that their carefully planned wilderness trip had ended in what felt like failure, even though she intellectually understood that they had made the right decision for their safety. "I'm sorry our honeymoon didn't turn out the way we planned," Emily said, as they descended through the forested sections of trail that had seemed so welcoming during their initial approach. "I know you would have been just as happy with a beach resort in Mexico, and instead I dragged you into a situation that could have been dangerous." Jacob reached for Emily's hand as they walked side by side on the wider sections of trail. "This wasn't your fault," he said firmly. "We planned carefully, we followed all the safety protocols, and we made responsible decisions when the situation changed. That's what partners do. They support each other and make good decisions together, even when things don't go according to plan." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching helicopter, flying low through the valley and clearly engaged in some kind of search or survey mission. Jacob pulled out his bright orange emergency whistle and blew 3 sharp blasts, the standard signal for "we need assistance," while Emily waved her arms to attract the pilot's attention. The helicopter circled their position several times before the pilot spotted them and acknowledged their signal with a hovering maneuver. Through the aircraft's open side door, they could see a uniformed figure with binoculars who appeared to be conducting some kind of search operation. The helicopter hovered nearby for several minutes, while the observer studied their position and apparently radioed information to someone else. Eventually, the helicopter moved away toward the lake area where they had been camping, though it continued to circle the general vicinity rather than departing the area entirely. Emily and Jacob resumed hiking toward the trailhead, both wondering what kind of search operation was underway and whether it might be related to their own bear encounters. The answer to their questions came about an hour later when they encountered a group of 4 people hiking rapidly up the trail toward the lake area. The group consisted of 2 uniformed park rangers, a conservation officer with Alberta Fish and Wildlife, and a civilian who carried specialized equipment that identified him as some kind of technical expert or researcher. The lead ranger, a woman named Officer Jennifer Walsh, who appeared to be in her 30s, with the weathered appearance of someone who spent most of her time outdoors, immediately approached Jacob and Emily with obvious urgency. "Are you the couple who've been camping at Site B47 for the past few days?" she asked without preamble. "We were camped there until this morning," Jacob replied, "but we decided to evacuate due to persistent bear activity around our campsite. We've been hiking out since early this morning, and we're planning to return to the trailhead this afternoon." Officer Walsh exchanged glances with her colleagues before continuing her questioning. "We've received reports of unusual bear behavior in that area, and we're investigating a possible human-habituated grizzly that may pose a public safety risk. Can you tell us about your specific encounters with this animal?" Emily pulled out her camera and showed the law enforcement officers her extensive photographic documentation of their bear encounters over the previous 3 days. The images clearly showed the size and behavior patterns of the animal, the progressive escalation of its boldness around their campsite, and the evidence of its systematic investigation of their camping area. The conservation officer, a man named Bill Thompson, who specialized in human-wildlife conflict resolution, studied Emily's photographs with professional interest. "This is definitely the animal we're looking for," he said after reviewing the images. "We've had 2 other reports of encounters with this bear in the past week, and the behavior pattern you're documenting suggests an animal that's losing its natural fear of humans." Officer Walsh explained that they were implementing an immediate closure of the B47 camping area and several other sites in the vicinity, while wildlife management specialists attempted to locate and assess the problem bear. The helicopter Emily and Jacob had seen was part of a coordinated effort to track the animal and determine whether it could be relocated or would need to be destroyed for public safety reasons. "You folks made the right decision to evacuate when you did," the conservation officer observed. "Bears that show this kind of persistent interest in human campsites are unpredictable and potentially dangerous. We've seen situations where human-habituated bears progress from investigating campsites to more aggressive behavior very rapidly." The ranger group was clearly in a hurry to reach the lake area and begin their investigation, but they took time to get detailed statements from Jacob and Emily about their bear encounters. The information they provided would be crucial for understanding the animal's behavior patterns and developing an appropriate management response. "When you reach the trailhead, please stop at the ranger station and provide a formal written statement about your encounters," Officer Walsh instructed. "We'll need official documentation for our investigation files, and the information you've gathered could be important for preventing future human-wildlife conflicts in this area." After the law enforcement group continued toward the lake area, Jacob and Emily resumed their hike toward the trailhead with mixed feelings about their role in what appeared to be developing into a major wildlife management situation. Emily felt guilty about the possibility that the bear they had encountered might be destroyed because of its interactions with humans, even though she intellectually understood that public safety had to take priority. The final section of their hike passed quickly as they descended through familiar terrain toward the parking area where their vehicle waited. Emily's excitement about reaching safety was tempered by sadness about the early end to their honeymoon adventure and concern about the fate of the magnificent grizzly bear that had dominated their wilderness experience. They reached the trailhead parking area in mid-afternoon, exhausted but relieved to have completed their evacuation safely. Their Toyota Highlander sat exactly where they had left it 4 days earlier, though it now seemed like a symbol of civilization and safety rather than just transportation. Emily leaned against the vehicle's warm metal surface and felt the tension of the previous 36 hours begin to drain from her body. Jacob loaded their packs into the vehicle while Emily took a few final photographs of the trailhead area and the mountains where they had experienced their abbreviated honeymoon adventure. Despite the stress and fear of their final day in the wilderness, she wanted to remember the incredible beauty of the place and the adventure they had shared, even if it hadn't ended as they had planned. Their stop at the ranger station took longer than expected as they provided detailed written statements about their bear encounters and participated in an extensive debriefing session with wildlife management officials. Emily's photographs were copied for the official investigation file, and she agreed to provide additional information if needed for the ongoing research into the bear's behavior patterns. The drive back to their hotel in Banff gave them their first opportunity to decompress and process the emotional impact of their wilderness experience. Emily found herself cycling between disappointment about their abbreviated honeymoon and pride in their ability to recognize a dangerous situation and respond appropriately. Jacob focused on the positive aspects of their adventure: the spectacular scenery, the successful wildlife photography, and their effectiveness as a team when faced with challenging circumstances. "Do you think we'll ever find out what happens to the bear?" Emily asked as they drove through the scenic Bow Valley toward town. "I know it was potentially dangerous, but it was also the most magnificent wild animal I've ever seen. Part of me hopes they can relocate it somewhere safer rather than having to destroy it." Jacob was studying the landscape around them and thinking about their experience from the broader perspective of wildlife conservation and human impact on natural ecosystems. "I hope so too," he said. "But I also understand that wildlife managers have to prioritize human safety. If that bear can't be successfully relocated or retrained to avoid humans, they might not have any choice about what happens next." They spent their final evening in Banff at a comfortable hotel, enjoying hot showers, comfortable beds, and the luxury of room service delivered food that they didn't have to cook over a camp stove. Emily worked on organizing her photographs from the trip, creating a digital album that told the story of their wilderness honeymoon adventure from the excited beginning to the dramatic conclusion. Despite the early termination of their camping trip, Emily found herself looking through hundreds of images that captured incredible memories: spectacular mountain scenery, wildlife encounters, moments of joy and discovery, and documentation of one of the most beautiful places either of them had ever experienced. The photographs reminded her that their honeymoon adventure had been successful in many ways, even if it hadn't ended as they had originally planned. Jacob spent the evening researching information about grizzly bear behavior and human-wildlife conflict management, trying to better understand their experience and learn from it for future wilderness adventures. He read scientific articles about bear psychology, case studies of successful wildlife relocations, and statistics about the rarity of dangerous bear encounters in well-managed wilderness areas. "I found some interesting information about grizzly bear relocations," Jacob reported as they prepared for bed in their comfortable hotel room. "Apparently, adult male bears are much harder to relocate successfully than females or younger animals. They tend to travel long distances to return to their original territory, and they often become more aggressive toward humans during the stress of relocation." Emily looked up from her photo editing with a concerned expression. "So our bear might be more likely to be destroyed than relocated. That seems like such a waste of a magnificent animal that was probably just following its natural instincts." "The reality is that once a bear loses its fear of humans and begins actively seeking out human food sources or camping areas, it becomes a significant public safety risk," Jacob explained. "Wildlife managers have to balance conservation goals with the safety of thousands of park visitors every year." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on their hotel room door. Jacob looked through the peephole to see Officer Walsh from the ranger station, still in uniform and apparently working late into the evening. He opened the door to find the ranger accompanied by the conservation officer they had met on the trail earlier that day. "I'm sorry to bother you folks so late in the evening," Officer Walsh said, "but we've had some significant developments in our investigation, and we need to get some additional information from you about your bear encounters." Emily invited the officers into their hotel room, offering them chairs and bottled water, while they explained the purpose of their visit. The news they brought was both concerning and tragic, casting their wilderness experience in a completely different light than anything they had previously considered. "We found the Morrison family this afternoon," Officer Walsh began carefully. "They had set up camp at the alternative site about 2 miles from where you were staying, following the plan you described to us earlier. Unfortunately, they encountered the same bear you had been dealing with, and the situation escalated very rapidly." Emily felt her stomach drop as she processed the implications of what the ranger was saying. "Are they okay? Was anyone hurt?" Conservation Officer Thompson answered her question with the measured tone of someone who delivered bad news as part of his professional responsibilities. "The bear attacked their campsite around midnight last night. David Morrison was killed while trying to protect his family, and his 16-year-old son Tyler was seriously injured. Linda Morrison and her daughter Emma managed to escape and were rescued by our helicopter team this morning." The hotel room fell into stunned silence as Jacob and Emily absorbed the shocking news. The bear that had seemed like a manageable wilderness challenge during their own encounter had proven capable of deadly violence just hours after they had evacuated their campsite. Emily began crying as she realized that the Morrison family had walked into danger, partly based on information and advice that she and Jacob had provided. "Was it the same bear?" Jacob asked, though he already suspected he knew the answer. "DNA evidence from the attack site confirms it was the same animal you encountered at your campsite," Officer Walsh confirmed. "The bear apparently followed your scent trail partway down the mountain, then circled back and located the Morrison family's camp. It exhibited extremely aggressive behavior that was completely different from the investigative behavior you experienced." Emily was overwhelmed by guilt and grief as she thought about Tyler Morrison's enthusiastic interest in wildlife photography and the wooden bear carving he had given her as a memento of their encounter. "This is our fault," she said through her tears. "If we had warned them more strongly, or if we had insisted they leave the area entirely, this never would have happened." Conservation Officer Thompson moved to reassure Emily that she and Jacob bore no responsibility for the tragedy. "You provided accurate information about the bear's behavior based on your own experience," he said firmly. "The Morrison family made their own decision to continue camping in the area, and they took precautions based on the information available to them. This attack was not predictable based on the bear's previous behavior." Officer Walsh explained that the bear had been located and destroyed later that morning after an extensive search operation involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and multiple law enforcement agencies. The animal had remained in the immediate vicinity of the attack site, exhibiting continued aggressive behavior that confirmed it posed an ongoing threat to public safety. "We need you to review your written statements and confirm that they accurately describe your encounters with this bear," Officer Walsh continued. "The information you provided will be crucial for our investigation into the incident and for developing better protocols to prevent similar tragedies in the future." The next several hours were spent in detailed review of Emily and Jacob's written statements, comparison of their photographic evidence with physical evidence from the attack site, and extensive discussion of the bear's behavior patterns leading up to the fatal encounter. Emily's photographs proved to be invaluable for understanding the animal's size, condition, and behavioral escalation over the course of their multi-day encounter. Your documentation is the most complete record we have of this bear's behavior during the period leading up to the attack, Conservation Officer Thompson observed. The progression from investigating your food storage to marking territory around your campsite to the aggressive behavior at the Morrison campsite tells a clear story of an animal that was rapidly losing its fear of humans. Emily found some small comfort in knowing that their experience might contribute to preventing future tragedies, but she continued to struggle with grief over David Morrison's death and concern for Tyler Morrison's injuries. The joyful wilderness honeymoon adventure she had planned had become connected to tragedy in ways she never could have anticipated. Jacob was processing the situation from his characteristic analytical perspective, trying to understand what factors had led to the bear's escalating aggression and whether there were lessons that could be applied to future wilderness safety protocols. Was there anything about our behavior or the Morrison family's behavior that might have triggered the bear's aggressive response? He asked. Current evidence suggests that this bear was already habituated to humans through previous encounters that we're still investigating, Officer Walsh replied. Adult male grizzlies that lose their fear of humans can become unpredictably aggressive, especially during the breeding season when hormone levels affect their behavior. This appears to have been a confluence of factors that created an extremely dangerous situation. The investigation continued for several more days as wildlife officials worked to understand the full scope of the bear's behavior and to develop recommendations for preventing similar incidents. Emily and Jacob extended their stay in Banff to participate in the investigation and to visit Tyler Morrison in the hospital where he was recovering from his injuries. Tyler Morrison's injuries were extensive but not life-threatening. Deep lacerations on his arms and back, where the bear had mauled him while he tried to help his father. His recovery would require multiple surgeries and months of physical therapy, but doctors expected him to regain full function eventually. His mother, Linda, and sister Emma were physically uninjured, but deeply traumatized by witnessing the attack and losing their husband and father. Emily's visit to Tyler in the hospital was one of the most difficult experiences of her life, as she struggled with guilt over the family's tragedy while trying to provide support and comfort. Tyler himself showed remarkable resilience and maturity, refusing to blame Emily and Jacob for what had happened and expressing gratitude that they had warned his family about the bear's presence. "You guys did everything right," Tyler told Emily during her visit. "You recognized a dangerous situation, you shared information with us, and you made the decision to leave when things felt unsafe. Dad knew the risks when he decided we should continue camping in the area. He was trying to give us the adventure we had planned, and he died protecting us. That's not your fault." The wooden bear carving Tyler had given Emily as a memento of their encounter became a treasured reminder of the Morrison family's courage and generosity in the face of tragedy. Emily kept the carving on her desk at home as a reminder of the importance of wilderness safety and the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters. The formal investigation into the bear attack concluded 6 weeks later with a comprehensive report that analyzed all available evidence and made recommendations for improving wilderness safety protocols. Emily and Jacob's photographic documentation and written statements were cited extensively in the report as providing crucial information about the bear's behavior leading up to the attack. The investigation concluded that the bear had likely been habituated to humans through previous unreported encounters with campers who had not followed proper food storage protocols. The animal's behavior during Emily and Jacob's encounter showed classic signs of a bear that was losing its natural fear of humans and beginning to view human campsites as potential food sources. Key recommendations from the investigation included improved education for wilderness visitors about recognizing signs of habituated bears, enhanced reporting systems for bear encounters, more frequent patrol of remote camping areas during peak season, and clearer protocols for when camping areas should be closed due to wildlife safety concerns. Emily and Jacob's honeymoon adventure became a case study that was used in wilderness safety courses throughout North America, helping to educate future generations of outdoor enthusiasts about the importance of proper wildlife safety protocols and the need to evacuate when bear behavior becomes concerning. Their experience demonstrated both the incredible beauty and the inherent risks of wilderness travel in grizzly bear habitat. The tragedy also led to lasting changes in park management policies, including more aggressive intervention when bears show signs of habituation to humans, and improved communication systems between different agencies responsible for wildlife management and visitor safety. The goal was to prevent future incidents by identifying and addressing problem wildlife behavior before it escalated to dangerous levels. 6 months after their abbreviated honeymoon, Emily and Jacob returned to the Canadian Rockies for a front-country camping trip that allowed them to experience the beauty of the area while staying in developed campgrounds with ranger presence and established safety protocols. Emily brought her camera and captured images of the same mountain ranges where they had experienced their wilderness adventure, though from the safer perspective of established visitor facilities. Their marriage had been strengthened rather than damaged by their shared experience of recognizing danger and making difficult decisions under pressure. They continued to enjoy wilderness adventures together, though they approached backcountry travel with enhanced respect for wildlife safety and a deeper understanding of the risks inherent in true wilderness experiences. Emily's photography from their honeymoon trip was eventually exhibited in a show about human-wildlife interactions, helping to educate the public about the importance of respecting wild animals and maintaining appropriate safety protocols when visiting their habitat. The images of the magnificent grizzly bear fishing in the mountain stream served as a reminder of both the incredible beauty of wildlife and the need for humans to maintain respectful distance from dangerous predators. The wooden bear carving from Tyler Morrison remained on Emily's desk as a daily reminder of their experience and the Morrison family's tragedy. Tyler recovered fully from his physical injuries and eventually became a wildlife biologist specializing in human-bear conflict resolution, dedicating his career to preventing the kind of tragedy that had claimed his father's life. Linda Morrison and her daughter Emma also channeled their grief into positive action, becoming advocates for improved wilderness safety education and supporting research into non-lethal methods for managing problem wildlife. Their loss had created a lasting legacy that would help protect both humans and bears through better understanding and management of human-wildlife interactions. Years later, when Emily and Jacob told the story of their honeymoon adventure to their own children, they emphasized the lessons they had learned about respecting wildlife, making safety-conscious decisions, and supporting each other during challenging situations. Their experience had become a defining moment in their relationship and a source of wisdom that guided their approach to future adventures and life challenges. The pristine wilderness, where they had spent 3 days in 2025, remained closed to camping for 2 full seasons, while wildlife managers implemented new safety protocols and monitoring systems. When it eventually reopened to visitors, it featured enhanced bear safety education, improved food storage facilities, and regular patrol by ranger staff during peak camping season. Emily often wondered what would have happened if they had made different decisions during their encounter with the grizzly bear, if they had left after the first night, or if they had stayed longer, or if they had chosen a different campsite entirely. But she eventually came to understand that their experience was simply one thread in the complex tapestry of wilderness conservation, where humans and wildlife share beautiful but dangerous landscapes that demand respect, preparation, and constant vigilance from all who venture into them. The blood moon honeymoon, as Emily privately came to think of their adventure, had ended not with romance under the stars, but with tragedy and loss that would affect multiple families for years to come. Yet it had also demonstrated the importance of wilderness safety protocols, the unpredictable nature of wildlife behavior, and the strength that comes from facing adversity together as a partnership committed to protecting each other and making responsible decisions even when they're difficult. Their story became a testament to the fact that wilderness adventure always involves risk, that proper preparation and safety protocols can reduce but never eliminate danger, and that the decisions made by outdoor enthusiasts can have consequences that extend far beyond their own experience. The Canadian Rockies remained as beautiful and compelling as ever, but Emily and Jacob's encounter with one magnificent and ultimately tragic grizzly bear had forever changed their understanding of what it means to be visitors in the wild places where humans are not the dominant species. The memorial service for David Morrison drew hundreds of people from across Western Canada, including many members of the outdoor recreation community who had been touched by the family's tragedy. Emily and Jacob attended the service, where they met dozens of other wilderness enthusiasts who shared their passion for backcountry adventure and their commitment to learning from the Morrison family's loss. In the years that followed, the Morrison family tragedy became a watershed moment in Canadian wilderness management, leading to improved protocols, better education, and more effective intervention strategies for managing human-wildlife conflicts. The beautiful but dangerous grizzly bear that had ended their honeymoon adventure became a symbol of the complex relationship between humans and wildlife in some of North America's last truly wild places. Emily kept all of her photographs from their honeymoon trip, including the images of the magnificent bear that had dominated their wilderness experience. When she looked at those photos years later, she saw not just a dangerous predator that had caused tragedy, but a wild animal that had been following its natural instincts in an environment where human activity had created an impossible situation. The bear's beauty and power remained undeniable, even in the context of the tragedy that had followed their encounter. Their blood moon honeymoon had lasted only 3 days in the wilderness, but its impact on their lives, their marriage, and their understanding of the natural world would last forever. It had been an adventure that tested their partnership, challenged their assumptions about wilderness safety, and ultimately strengthened their commitment to each other and to the wild places they continued to love despite their dangerous beauty. In the end, it had been exactly the kind of life-changing experience that the best adventures provide, though not at all in the way they had originally planned or hoped. The next stories: Grizzly Bear Malls, pilot after crash landing. November 8th, 2024. The morning of November 8th, 2024 dawned crisp and clear across the Helena National Forest, with temperatures hovering just below freezing and a thin layer of frost coating the pine needles that stretched endlessly across the Montana wilderness. Captain Richard "Rick" Evans, a 52-year-old veteran pilot with over 28 years of experience flying everything from crop dusters to commercial airliners, had no way of knowing that this routine cargo flight would be his last. At 6:47 a.m. Mountain Standard Time, Rick completed his pre-flight inspection of the twin-engine Beechcraft King Air 350, tail number N847PE, at the Billings-Logan International Airport, running his weathered hands along the aircraft's aluminum skin with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed this ritual thousands of times before. Rick stood 6 feet 2 inches tall with graying hair that he kept meticulously trimmed, a habit instilled during his 12 years of service in the Air Force before transitioning to civilian aviation. His deep-set brown eyes, framed by crow's feet, earned through decades of squinting against sunlight at altitude, reflected a quiet confidence that had earned him the respect of colleagues throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Today, he wore his standard uniform, navy blue slacks, crisp white shirt with gold epaulets bearing 4 stripes, and a matching navy blazer with the logo of Mountain Air Cargo Services embroidered on the breast pocket. His wedding ring, a simple gold band worn thin after 26 years of marriage to his wife Sarah, caught the early morning light as he signed off on the maintenance logbook. The cargo manifest showed a routine load, medical supplies bound for the Helena Regional Airport, including several cases of insulin, surgical instruments, and blood plasma that would be distributed to rural clinics throughout Lewis and Clark County. The flight plan called for a northwesterly route following Interstate 90 before turning north toward Helena, a journey Rick had completed 247 times over the past 8 years without incident. Weather conditions appeared ideal, with clear skies forecast along the entire route and light winds that would provide a smooth ride for the temperature-sensitive medical cargo. At 7:23 a.m., Rick contacted Billings Ground Control and received clearance to taxi to runway 10L. The King Air's twin Pratt & Whitney PT-6A-60A turboprop engines spun up with their characteristic high-pitched whine, a sound that never failed to stir something deep in Rick's chest, despite the countless times he had heard it. As he guided the aircraft along the taxiway, Rick's mind wandered briefly to his plans for the weekend. Sarah had suggested they drive up to Glacier National Park to see if any autumn colors remained on the aspens, and their daughter Jennifer, now 24 and working as a nurse in Missoula, had promised to join them with her fiancé Michael. It would be one of their last opportunities to enjoy the mountains before winter snow made the high passes impassable. The tower cleared Rick for takeoff at 7:31 a.m., and the King Air accelerated smoothly down the runway, its landing gear retracting with mechanical precision as Helena lay 240 nautical miles to the northwest. Rick settled into the comfortable rhythm of cruise flight, trimming the aircraft for level flight at 15,000 feet, while monitoring the engine parameters displayed on the glass cockpit's primary flight display. The morning sun cast long shadows across the landscape below, transforming the rugged Montana terrain into a tapestry of golden light and deep purple shadows that stretched between snow-capped peaks. Meanwhile, 180 miles northwest of Rick's position, a massive male grizzly bear, designated as Bear 411 by Montana Fish, wildlife and parks biologists, was beginning what would be his final day of foraging before entering winter hibernation. The bear, estimated to weigh 847 pounds and standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder when on all fours, had spent the past 6 weeks engaged in hyperphagia, the intense feeding behavior that allows grizzlies to accumulate the fat reserves necessary for surviving Montana's harsh winters. Bear 411 had been fitted with a GPS collar 3 years earlier as part of a long-term study tracking grizzly movement patterns in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the lead wildlife biologist monitoring Bear 411's movements from her office at the University of Montana, had been tracking the massive boar since early September when he emerged from the high alpine zones where he had spent the summer months. Amanda, 38 years old with shoulder-length black hair that she typically kept pulled back in a functional ponytail, had dedicated her career to understanding grizzly bear behavior and habitat requirements. Her doctorate dissertation, completed 7 years earlier, had focused specifically on pre-hibernation feeding patterns and how climate change was affecting traditional food sources in the northern Rockies. The GPS data streaming to Amanda's computer screen showed that Bear 411 had established a territory encompassing roughly 12 square miles of prime habitat in the Helena National Forest, an area that included several natural meadows rich with whitebark pine nuts, mountain ash berries, and the occasional elk or deer carcass that provided crucial protein. The bear's movement patterns over the past week had been relatively predictable, following established game trails between feeding areas with the methodical efficiency of an animal driven by millions of years of evolutionary programming. What Amanda couldn't know from the sterile GPS coordinates appearing on her monitor was that Bear 411 had been growing increasingly aggressive as winter approached. The bear's testosterone levels, already elevated during this crucial pre-hibernation period, had been further heightened by several encounters with younger male bears attempting to encroach on his territory. 2 days earlier, Bear 411 had engaged in a violent confrontation with a 6-year-old male near Trout Creek, leaving deep claw marks on several trees that would serve as warnings to other bears for months to come. At 8:47 a.m., Rick was maintaining his cruising altitude of 15,000 feet and approaching the halfway point of his journey when the first indication of trouble appeared on his instruments. The left engine's turbine inlet temperature began climbing slowly but steadily, moving from the normal operating range of 650 degrees Celsius into the amber caution zone. Rick's eyes immediately focused on the engine monitoring display, his training taking over as he began working through the appropriate checklist procedures. The temperature continued climbing: 720 degrees, 740 degrees, 760 degrees. Billings Center Mountain Air 847, Papa Echo, Rick radioed to air traffic control, his voice maintaining the calm professionalism that had been drilled into him through decades of training. I'm showing high turbine inlet temperature on the left engine and would like to declare a precautionary emergency. The controller's response crackled through Rick's headset with practiced efficiency. Mountain Air 847, Papa Echo, Billings Center copies your emergency declaration. Say your intentions and souls on board. 847, Papa Echo is single pilot with no passengers. I'm going to continue toward Helena and monitor the engine. If conditions deteriorate, I may need to divert to the nearest suitable airport. Rick's hands moved methodically across the instrument panel, reducing power on the affected engine while increasing power on the right side to maintain altitude and airspeed. The turbine inlet temperature stabilized momentarily at 785 degrees Celsius, still well into the caution range, but no longer climbing. Rick allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism, knowing that modern turboprop engines were designed to operate safely, even with elevated temperatures for limited periods. His right hand rested on the condition lever for the left engine, ready to shut it down completely if the temperature entered the red danger zone above 810 degrees. For the next 18 minutes, Rick nursed the ailing King Air northwestward through the crisp morning air, constantly monitoring engine parameters while calculating fuel consumption rates and distance to alternate airports. The aircraft's performance remained acceptable on the reduced power setting, though Rick knew he was walking a technological tightrope 15,000 feet above some of the most rugged and unforgiving terrain in North America. Below him, the landscape had transitioned from the rolling plains around Billings to the increasingly mountainous topography of south-central Montana, with peaks rising to over 11,000 feet and valleys carved deep by millennia of glacial action. At 9:05 a.m., the left engine's condition deteriorated rapidly. The turbine inlet temperature spiked to 820 degrees Celsius, well into the red danger zone, while simultaneously the engine began producing rough, irregular power that caused the entire aircraft to vibrate. Rick immediately moved the left engine's condition lever to the feather position, effectively shutting down the engine and allowing its propeller to align with the relative wind to minimize drag. Billing Center 847. Papa Echo is shutting down the left engine due to over-temperature condition. I'm declaring a full emergency and will need immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport. Rick's voice remained steady despite the gravity of his situation. The King Air was certified for single-engine operations, but flying on one engine significantly reduced performance, particularly at high altitudes and in mountainous terrain. 847 Papa Echo, Billing Center copies. The nearest airport is Helena Regional, bearing 315 degrees at 67 nautical miles. Current weather shows ceiling and visibility unlimited with light winds. Emergency equipment is being notified. Rick began configuring the aircraft for single-engine flight, following procedures he had practiced countless times in the simulator but had never needed to execute in actual flight. The King Air's performance on one engine was marginal at their current altitude, particularly given the density-altitude effects of the mountain environment. He needed to descend to a more efficient altitude while simultaneously navigating toward Helena through increasingly challenging terrain. As Rick worked through the emergency procedures, Bear 411 was investigating an unusual scent that had drifted across his territory on the morning breeze. The massive grizzly raised his enormous head, black nose twitching as he analyzed the complex mixture of odors carried by the wind. Years of experience had taught him to distinguish between the natural scents of his forest environment and the artificial odors that sometimes accompanied human intrusion into his domain. This particular scent was unfamiliar, a sharp, chemical odor that seemed out of place among the familiar fragrances of pine resin, decomposing leaves, and the musky scent markings of other wildlife. Dr. Rodriguez, monitoring Bear 411's GPS collar data from her university office, noticed that the bear had stopped moving and remained stationary for an unusually long period. The GPS coordinates placed him near the headwaters of Trout Creek, roughly 15 miles northeast of Helena, in an area of dense forest interspersed with small meadows. Amanda made a note in her research log to investigate the location during her next field survey, unaware that she was documenting the precise moment when Bear 411's path would intersect catastrophically with Rick's failing aircraft. At 9:17 a.m., Rick faced a critical decision. The King Air was losing altitude, despite his efforts to maintain 12,000 feet, and the mountainous terrain ahead was rising to meet him. The peaks surrounding Helena reached elevations of over 8,000 feet, with several ridgelines exceeding 9,000 feet directly along his planned route. On a single engine, the aircraft lacked the power to climb over these obstacles, forcing Rick to choose between attempting to navigate through the mountain passes or making an immediate emergency landing in unsuitable terrain. Billing Center 847. Papa Echo is unable to maintain altitude on single engine. I'm going to attempt to reach Helena, but may need to make a forced landing if terrain clearance becomes critical. Rick's voice carried the first hint of tension as he scanned the landscape below, searching for any open area that might accommodate an emergency landing. The controller's response reflected the gravity of the situation. 847 Papa Echo, understand you may need to make a forced landing. Search and rescue assets are being activated. Please advise your exact position and heading. Rick read his GPS coordinates aloud while simultaneously scanning his sectional chart for potential landing sites. The terrain below was unforgiving. Steep mountainsides covered in dense forest, narrow valleys carved by fast-flowing streams, and scattered clearings that were either too small for a safe landing or positioned at dangerous angles on hillsides. The King Air continued its inexorable descent, now passing through 10,500 feet, with the highest terrain still ahead. At 9:23 a.m., Rick spotted what appeared to be his best option, a relatively straight section of Trout Creek Valley that ran roughly northwest toward Helena. The valley floor was narrow but appeared to be free of major obstacles, though Rick knew the approach would be treacherous given the surrounding terrain. He began configuring the aircraft for an off-airport landing, lowering the landing gear and extending partial flaps while maintaining the precise airspeed that would give him the best glide performance. Billing Center 847 Papa Echo is attempting a forced landing in the Trout Creek Valley, approximately 22 miles northeast of Helena. Please notify search and rescue of my approximate position. Rick's transmission would be his last communication with air traffic control. The King Air descended through the mountain valley like a wounded bird, its single operating engine straining to provide enough power to maintain a controlled approach angle. Rick's hands gripped the yoke with practiced precision, making constant adjustments to maintain the narrow corridor between the valley walls while managing his rapidly diminishing altitude. The aircraft's airspeed indicator showed 95 knots, just 5 knots above the minimum speed required to maintain control, leaving no margin for error. At 500 feet above the valley floor, Rick encountered severe downdrafts caused by the mountainous terrain disrupting the normal flow of air. The King Air dropped suddenly, losing 200 feet in a matter of seconds despite Rick's efforts to maintain his approach path. The tree line rushed toward him with alarming speed, individual pine branches becoming clearly visible through the windscreen as he fought to stretch his glide just a few hundred yards further to a small clearing visible ahead. The aircraft struck the tops of several mature ponderosa pines at 9:26 a.m., the impact tearing away sections of the wing and causing the King Air to pitch violently downward. Rick had perhaps 3 seconds to brace for impact before the aircraft slammed into the forest floor at approximately 78 knots, the fuselage crumpling as it plowed through smaller trees and undergrowth before coming to rest against a massive fallen log. The silence that followed the crash was profound, broken only by the settling sounds of twisted metal and the distant hiss of escaping hydraulic fluid. Rick hung upside down in his harness, suspended by the aircraft's inverted position after it had flipped during the final moments of the crash sequence. Blood ran from a deep gash on his forehead where his head had struck the side window, and his left shoulder felt as though it had been dislocated during the violent deceleration. But he was alive, conscious, and capable of movement despite the pain radiating through his body. The King Air's cockpit had been partially crushed during the impact, but the aircraft's robust construction had created a survivable space around Rick's seat. The instrument panel flickered intermittently, with the dying gasps of the electrical system casting eerie shadows across the wreckage as Rick worked to free himself from his restraints. His fingers, slick with blood from multiple cuts, fumbled with the harness release mechanism while his mind processed the immediate priorities. Escape the aircraft, assess injuries, activate emergency beacon, and await rescue. Rick managed to release his shoulder harnesses and fell heavily against the cockpit ceiling, now serving as the floor of his inverted world. The aircraft's main door was jammed shut by the impact damage, but the emergency exit window on the right side of the cockpit appeared to be functional. Rick kicked repeatedly against the window's release mechanism until it finally gave way, allowing him to squeeze through the opening onto the forest floor. The crash site was located in a narrow draw approximately 800 yards from Trout Creek, surrounded by dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir that had effectively hidden the aircraft from any potential aerial searches. Rick stood unsteadily beside the wreckage, taking inventory of his injuries while surveying the wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. His left shoulder was definitely dislocated, making it difficult to raise his arm above chest level. Multiple cuts on his face and hands continued to bleed steadily, and he suspected he might have cracked several ribs based on the sharp pain that accompanied each breath. More concerning than his injuries was his location. Rick estimated that the crash site was at least 15 miles from the nearest road, deep in rugged mountain terrain that would challenge even experienced wilderness travelers. The November weather added another layer of danger, with overnight temperatures forecast to drop well below freezing and the possibility of snow that could make any rescue attempt exponentially more difficult. Rick activated his personal emergency locator beacon, a small device clipped to his flight vest that would transmit his GPS coordinates to search and rescue satellites. The device's LED indicator confirmed that it was transmitting properly, though Rick knew that search operations might be delayed by several hours depending on how quickly his overdue aircraft was reported missing. He gathered what survival supplies he could from the wreckage: a small first aid kit, emergency blanket, flare gun with 6 cartridges, and 2 bottles of water from his flight bag. The smell of aviation fuel permeated the crash site, creating a sharp chemical odor that mixed unpleasantly with the pine-scented mountain air. Rick could see several small fuel leaks where the aircraft's wing tanks had been punctured during the crash, creating dark stains on the forest floor and filling the immediate area with volatile fumes. The fuel represented both a fire hazard and a potential attractant for wildlife, though Rick's primary concern remained hypothermia, as the afternoon temperature had already begun dropping toward the forecast low of 18 degrees Fahrenheit. What Rick couldn't know was that Bear 411 had detected the crash from over 2 miles away. The massive grizzly's acute sense of hearing had picked up the sound of the King Air's impact through the forest, followed by the unfamiliar chemical odors now drifting downwind from the wreckage site. The bear's curiosity was immediately aroused by these foreign sensations, overriding his normal caution around anything associated with human activity. Bear 411 began moving steadily toward the crash site, following his nose through the dense forest with the silent efficiency of a predator perfectly adapted to his environment. The bear's massive paws, each equipped with claws extending up to 4 inches in length, left deep impressions in the soft forest floor as he navigated between trees and over fallen logs. His thick brown fur, darkened to nearly black in many areas and already grown to winter thickness, provided perfect camouflage against the shadows of the late autumn forest. Dr. Rodriguez, still monitoring the GPS data from her university office, noticed that Bear 411 had resumed movement after his earlier stationary period. The bear's track showed a purposeful heading toward an area she knew contained several small meadows and seasonal streams, typical foraging habitat that wouldn't normally attract her attention. Amanda made another routine entry in her research log, noting the time and direction of the bear's movement while remaining unaware of the tragedy beginning to unfold in the wilderness. At 10:47 a.m., Rick began experiencing the first symptoms of shock as his body's response to trauma and blood loss started affecting his judgment and coordination. He had attempted to splint his dislocated shoulder using materials from the aircraft, but the makeshift bandaging was inadequate to control the bleeding from his head wound. The combination of pain medication from the first aid kit and his body's natural endorphin response was creating a dangerous sense of euphoria that masked the severity of his condition. Rick decided to leave the immediate crash site and attempt to reach Trout Creek, reasoning that the stream would provide water and might lead to a trail or road that would improve his chances of rescue. This decision, while logical under normal circumstances, would prove fatal given his injured condition and the presence of Bear 411 moving steadily toward the crash site. Rick gathered his emergency supplies and began walking north through the forest, following what appeared to be a game trail in the direction he believed would lead to the creek. The trail Rick was following had indeed been created by wildlife, primarily elk and deer, moving between feeding and watering areas throughout the valley. What Rick couldn't recognize in his increasingly compromised mental state was that these same trails were regularly used by predators, including the massive grizzly bear now approaching from the southeast. The game trail would funnel both man and bear toward an inevitable confrontation in a small meadow approximately 400 yards from the crash site. Bear 411's approach to the crash site was methodical and cautious, as befitted a mature male grizzly with decades of wilderness survival experience. The bear paused frequently to sample the air, testing for any signs of immediate danger while simultaneously tracking the increasingly strong chemical odors emanating from the wreckage. The combination of aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic scent of blood created an olfactory cocktail that the bear found both intriguing and slightly alarming. At 11:15 a.m., Bear 411 reached the crash site and began a careful investigation of the wreckage. The massive bear approached the inverted King Air from downwind, using his acute sense of smell to gather information about this unprecedented intrusion into his territory. The chemical odors were strongest near the aircraft's wings, where fuel continued to seep from damaged tanks. But the bear also detected the unmistakable scent of human blood leading away from the wreckage toward the north. Meanwhile, Rick had covered approximately 300 yards from the crash site when he was forced to stop and rest against a large boulder. The combination of his injuries, shock, and the physical exertion of hiking through difficult terrain was rapidly depleting his already compromised energy reserves. His vision had become slightly blurred, and he was experiencing periods of confusion that made it difficult to maintain his bearing toward what he hoped was Trout Creek. The emergency locator beacon continued transmitting Rick's position to search and rescue satellites, but the complex process of detecting, analyzing, and responding to emergency signals meant that rescue operations had not yet been initiated. Rick's aircraft was not yet officially overdue, as his flight plan allowed for potential weather delays that were common in mountain flying. The first search aircraft would not be launched for another 3 hours, by which time the situation in the forest would have reached its tragic conclusion. Bear 411 spent nearly 20 minutes investigating the crash site, using his powerful claws to probe various parts of the wreckage while his brain processed the complex sensory information. The bear's investigation was thorough and systematic, as he had learned through decades of wilderness survival that unknown situations required careful evaluation before committing to any particular course of action. The chemical odors from the aircraft were unlike anything in his previous experience, but they were clearly associated with the blood scent trail leading away from the site. The decision to follow Rick's trail was not immediate or impulsive. Bear 411 circled the crash site several times, approaching from different angles while continuously sampling the air for any changes in the scent patterns. The bear's massive head, which measured nearly 18 inches from nose to the back of his skull, swiveled constantly as he processed visual, auditory, and olfactory information. Finally, the combination of curiosity and the increasingly strong blood scent overcame the bear's natural caution, and he began following Rick's trail northward through the forest. Rick's condition continued to deteriorate as he struggled through the wilderness toward his imagined salvation at Trout Creek. The head wound, while not immediately life-threatening, was causing sufficient blood loss to impair his cognitive function and physical coordination. His dislocated shoulder had begun to swell significantly, further limiting his mobility and increasing his pain levels despite the medication from the first aid kit. At 11:32 a.m., Rick reached the small meadow where the game trail he had been following intersected with several other animal paths. The opening in the forest canopy provided welcome sunlight that helped combat the hypothermia beginning to affect his extremities, but it also offered clear sight lines in multiple directions that would soon prove crucial to the developing encounter. Rick decided to rest in the meadow while attempting to get his bearings and plan his next move toward the creek he could hear flowing somewhere to the north. Bear 411's pursuit of Rick's trail was relentless, but not hurried. The massive grizzly moved through the forest with surprising stealth for an animal weighing nearly 850 pounds, his padded feet making almost no sound on the soft forest floor. The bear paused frequently to examine Rick's tracks, reading the subtle signs that told the story of an injured human struggling through unfamiliar terrain. The blood scent was growing stronger, indicating that Bear 411 was closing the distance to his quarry. The bear's hunting instincts, dormant during months of foraging on nuts, berries, and roots, began to emerge as the pursuit continued. While grizzly bears are primarily omnivorous, they are also opportunistic predators, capable of taking prey as large as elk or moose when circumstances present the opportunity. The combination of an injured animal leaving a clear scent trail triggered ancestral behaviors that had been refined through millions of years of evolution. Rick sat on a fallen log at the edge of the meadow, attempting to clean his head wound with water from one of his bottles while evaluating his options for continuing toward Trout Creek. The sound of running water seemed to be coming from multiple directions, suggesting that he might be near the confluence of several streams feeding into the main creek drainage. His map-reading skills, normally excellent, were compromised by his head injury, making it difficult to correlate the terrain features he could observe with his memory of the sectional chart he had studied before the flight. The first indication that Rick was not alone in the meadow came at 11:44 a.m., when he heard a sound that initially didn't register as significant. The soft padding of large feet moving through dry grass approximately 30 yards to his south. Rick looked up from his makeshift first aid efforts and saw Bear 411 emerging from the tree line, moving directly toward him with the measured gait of an animal that had already made the decision to investigate this unusual intruder in his territory. The sight of the massive grizzly bear caused an immediate surge of adrenaline that temporarily cleared Rick's head and sharpened his situational awareness. Bear 411 stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, and appeared even larger due to his thick winter coat and the distinctive shoulder hump that marked him as a mature male grizzly. The bear's small dark eyes remained focused on Rick, while his black nose continuously sampled the air, gathering information about this unexpected encounter. Rick's wilderness survival training, received during his military service 28 years earlier, had included basic information about bear encounters, but the reality of facing an 850-pound predator while injured and alone was far beyond anything covered in classroom instruction. Rick slowly reached for the bear spray attached to his belt, knowing that the small canister represented his only realistic defense against the approaching grizzly. Bear 411 continued his approach, covering the distance between the tree line and Rick's position with deliberate steps that brought him to within 20 yards of the injured pilot. The bear had not yet displayed any overtly aggressive behaviors, but his body language indicated that he was evaluating Rick as a potential threat or prey item. The grizzly's ears remained forward and alert, rotating slightly to capture any sounds that might indicate additional humans in the area. The critical moment came when Rick attempted to stand up from the fallen log where he had been resting. The sudden movement, combined with the strong scent of blood from his injuries, triggered Bear 411's predatory response. The massive grizzly dropped his head low and began advancing more rapidly, covering the remaining distance with powerful strides that demonstrated the remarkable speed capabilities of these apex predators. Rick managed to deploy his bear spray when the grizzly was approximately 12 feet away, sending a cloud of concentrated capsaicin toward the approaching bear. Under normal circumstances, bear spray is highly effective at deterring grizzly attacks, but several factors worked against Rick in this critical moment. The light breeze in the meadow dispersed much of the spray before it could reach the bear's sensitive nose and eyes, and Rick's injured condition prevented him from maintaining steady aim during the deployment. Bear 411 charged through the dissipating cloud of bear spray, his momentum carrying him directly into Rick with the crushing force of a small automobile traveling at 25 miles per hour. The initial impact drove Rick backward onto the forest floor, while the bear's massive claws raked across his chest, tearing through his uniform shirt and leaving deep, parallel gashes that immediately began bleeding profusely. Rick's scream echoed through the forest as Bear 411's powerful jaws clamped down on his left thigh, the bear's 4-inch canine teeth penetrating completely through the muscle and striking bone. The grizzly began shaking his massive head from side to side, a behavior designed to break the neck of prey animals, but which in Rick's case caused catastrophic damage to blood vessels and muscles in his leg. The pain was beyond anything Rick had ever experienced, a white-hot agony that threatened to cause him to lose consciousness. The attack entered a brief pause when Bear 411 released his grip on Rick's thigh and stepped back to reassess the situation. The bear's face was now covered with Rick's blood, and his small, dark eyes showed the heightened alertness of a predator fully committed to the kill. Rick attempted to crawl away from the bear, leaving a trail of blood on the meadow grass as he tried desperately to reach the tree line where he might find some protection. Bear 411's second attack was even more devastating than the first. The massive grizzly pounced on Rick's prone form, using his enormous weight to pin the injured pilot to the ground, while his claws inflicted terrible wounds across Rick's back and shoulders. The bear's powerful jaws found Rick's neck, and the crushing pressure of the bite immediately severed major blood vessels and damaged the cervical spine. Rick's struggles ceased within seconds, as his life ebbed away beneath the overwhelming power of nature's most formidable predator. The entire attack lasted less than 3 minutes from the initial contact to Rick's death, but the aftermath would continue for several more minutes as Bear 411 investigated his kill and began the process of claiming it as his own. The bear dragged Rick's body approximately 50 yards into the forest, following instincts that drove him to secure his prey away from potential scavengers or competitors. The massive grizzly then began the methodical process of feeding, starting with the internal organs that provided the highest concentration of nutrients needed for his approaching hibernation. Dr. Rodriguez, monitoring Bear 411's GPS collar data from her university office, noticed that the bear had again become stationary in the same general area where he had stopped earlier that morning. The GPS coordinates indicated that the bear was in suitable foraging habitat, so Amanda wasn't immediately concerned by the stationary behavior. She made another routine entry in her research log, unaware that she was documenting the precise time and location of Rick's death. At 12:15 p.m., exactly 48 minutes after Rick's emergency locator beacon had first activated, the first search and rescue coordinator received notification of a potential aircraft emergency in the Helena area. The initial response was coordinated by the Montana Aeronautical Division in conjunction with the Civil Air Patrol and local sheriff's departments. But the remote location and rugged terrain would significantly complicate rescue operations. Captain Jennifer Walsh of the Montana Air National Guard received the mission assignment at 12:32 p.m. while conducting routine training operations at the Great Falls Air National Guard Base. Jennifer, a 34-year-old pilot with 12 years of military experience, had participated in dozens of search and rescue missions throughout Montana and was intimately familiar with the challenging conditions presented by mountain searches. Her HH-60 Pavehawk helicopter, equipped with sophisticated search and rescue equipment, would serve as the primary search platform for locating Rick's aircraft. The initial search area was calculated based on Rick's last known position, transmitted to air traffic control before the emergency landing. creating a search grid covering approximately 120 square miles of mountainous terrain northeast of Helena. Captain Walsh and her crew, including Technical Sergeant Michael Torres as flight engineer and Staff Sergeant Lisa Chen as rescue specialist, departed Great Falls at 1:17 p.m. with a full load of rescue equipment and medical supplies. The first aerial search pass over the crash site occurred at 1:52 p.m., but the King Air's wreckage remained hidden beneath the forest canopy, despite the sophisticated sensors aboard Captain Walsh's helicopter. The thick stands of mature conifers effectively concealed the aircraft from visual detection, while the complex terrain created radar shadows that prevented electronic identification of the crash site. The search crew would need to expand their search pattern and rely on the emergency locator beacon signal to guide them to Rick's precise location. Bear 411 remained at the kill site throughout the afternoon, alternately feeding on Rick's remains and sleeping in the afternoon sunshine that filtered through the forest canopy. The massive grizzly showed no inclination to abandon his kill, despite the increasing noise from search aircraft crisscrossing the sky above his position. The bear's behavior was consistent with established patterns of grizzly bears defending their kills against any perceived threats, including the unfamiliar sounds of helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft participating in the search operation. The first ground-based search teams began deploying at 2:30 p.m., with experienced wilderness rescue volunteers from Lewis and Clark County Search and Rescue coordinating with professionals from the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Team leader Robert Bob McAllister, a 57-year-old retired firefighter with over 30 years of mountain rescue experience, assembled an 8-person team equipped for overnight operations in challenging terrain. Bob had participated in countless search and rescue missions throughout his career, but he understood that this particular operation presented unusual challenges due to the remote location and the approaching winter weather. Overnight temperatures were forecast to drop to 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, with possible snow squalls that could reduce visibility and make helicopter operations impossible. The search teams would need to locate Rick quickly if he had any chance of surviving his injuries and the harsh mountain environment. The search team included paramedic Sarah Jenkins, a 29-year-old emergency medical technician with specialized training in wilderness medicine. Tracker James "Jim" Crow Feather, a 42-year-old member of the Little Shell tribe whose traditional skills complemented modern search techniques. Communications specialist David Park, a 36-year-old volunteer who maintained radio contact between ground teams and the incident command post, and 4 additional volunteers with varying specialties in technical rescue, wilderness navigation, and emergency medical care. At 3:15 p.m., the search and rescue teams received a significant breakthrough when Captain Walsh's helicopter detected the emergency locator beacon signal from Rick's personal device. The signal provided a precise GPS coordinate that placed the source in a narrow valley approximately 18 miles northeast of Helena, consistent with the projected flight path of Rick's distressed aircraft. Captain Walsh immediately established a hover over the coordinates while her crew attempted to locate visual signs of the crash. The thick forest canopy prevented Captain Walsh from seeing the aircraft wreckage directly, but her crew spotted several trees with freshly broken branches tops that indicated a possible aircraft impact. The helicopter's thermal imaging camera detected a heat signature consistent with spilled aviation fuel, providing additional confirmation that they had located the crash site. However, the narrow valley and surrounding terrain made it impossible to land the helicopter near the wreckage, necessitating a complex rope insertion of rescue personnel. Staff Sergeant Chen prepared for immediate deployment via fast rope insertion, despite the challenging conditions presented by the mountainous terrain and unpredictable wind currents flowing through the valley. Chen, a veteran of over 40 rescue missions during her 8-year Air Force career, had extensive experience in mountain rescue operations, but had never encountered a situation involving both aircraft wreckage and potential wildlife hazards. The rope insertion was completed successfully at 3:41 p.m., with Chen touching down in the small meadow where Rick had encountered Bear 411 just 4 hours earlier. The blood-stained grass and obvious signs of struggle were immediately apparent to Chen's trained eyes, though she initially assumed the blood evidence was related to Rick's aircraft accident injuries rather than a wildlife attack. Chen began following the blood trail away from the meadow while maintaining radio contact with Captain Walsh's helicopter circling overhead. The discovery of Rick's remains occurred at 3:47 p.m. when Chen followed the blood trail into the forest and encountered Bear 411, still defending his kill. The massive grizzly bear emerged from behind a cluster of fallen logs approximately 20 yards from Chen's position, his massive head and shoulders clearly visible above the undergrowth as he assessed this new threat to his food source. Chen immediately radioed her situation to the helicopter crew while slowly backing away from the bear and reaching for the M4 carbine slung across her chest. Pavehawk 17, Rescue 1, has located the victim and encountered a large grizzly bear defending the remains. The victim appears to be deceased from obvious trauma, requesting immediate backup and wildlife management support. Chen's radio transmission maintained professional composure despite the extreme danger of her situation. Bear 411's response to Chen's presence was immediate and unmistakable. The massive grizzly began advancing toward her with the distinctive huffing vocalizations and forward ear position that wildlife experts recognize as clear indicators of an imminent attack. The bear had invested significant energy in killing and partially consuming Rick's remains, and was not about to abandon his kill to another potential competitor. Chen's military training took over as she raised her M4 carbine and placed the weapon's sights on the advancing grizzly's center mass. The range was approximately 15 yards and decreasing rapidly as Bear 411 charged directly toward her position. Chen fired 3 controlled pairs of 5.56mm rounds into the bear's chest cavity, but the massive grizzly's momentum carried him forward for several more strides before the trauma from the gunshots began to affect his nervous system. Bear 411 collapsed approximately 8 feet from Chen's position, his massive body convulsing briefly before becoming still. The bear's death was relatively quick and humane given the circumstances, but Chen remained in a defensive position for several minutes while confirming that the threat had been neutralized. She then approached Rick's remains and began the grim process of documenting the scene and preparing for recovery operations. The condition of Rick's body confirmed that he had been killed by the grizzly bear rather than succumbing to injuries sustained during the aircraft crash. The massive trauma to his neck, chest and limbs was consistent with a predatory attack by a large bear, while the pattern of feeding indicated that Bear 411 had been treating Rick's remains as a legitimate kill rather than simply scavenging an already deceased human. Captain Walsh's helicopter established a landing zone in the meadow where Chen had initially inserted, allowing additional rescue personnel and wildlife management officials to be transported to the scene. The recovery operation would require specialized equipment to extract both Rick's remains and the deceased grizzly bear from the forest, while maintaining the integrity of what had now become both a fatality investigation and a wildlife incident requiring federal oversight. Dr. Rodriguez received notification of Bear 411's death at 4:23 p.m. through an automated alert generated by the bear's GPS collar, which had detected the cessation of movement and vital signs. The loss of a mature male grizzly from her research population was significant from a scientific standpoint, but Amanda was also deeply saddened by the circumstances that had led to the bear's death. Bear 411 had been a magnificent example of his species, perfectly adapted to his mountain environment until the tragic intersection with human activity. The investigation into Rick's death would ultimately involve multiple agencies, including the National Transportation Safety Board for the aircraft accident, the Federal Aviation Administration for regulatory compliance issues, Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks for the wildlife attack, and the Lewis and Clark County Coroner's Office for the official determination of cause of death. Each agency would conduct separate investigations with different focuses and methodologies, creating a complex web of official inquiries that would continue for months. NTSB investigator Patricia Williams arrived at the crash site on November 10th, 2 days after the accident, leading a team of specialists in aircraft systems, power plant engineering, and human factors analysis. Patricia, a 22-year veteran of aircraft accident investigation with expertise in turboprop aircraft operations, would be responsible for determining the probable cause of the engine failure that forced Rick's emergency landing in the wilderness. The King Air's left engine showed evidence of catastrophic internal failure of the power turbine assembly, with metallurgical analysis later revealing fatigue cracking in several critical components. The engine had accumulated 8,247 hours of operation since its last major overhaul, well within manufacturer specifications, but approaching the interval where increased inspection frequency was recommended. The investigation would ultimately conclude that the engine failure was caused by normal wear progression rather than maintenance deficiencies or manufacturing defects. Rick's piloting performance during the emergency was exemplary, according to Patricia's analysis of the flight data recorder information and air traffic control communications. His decision-making process, from the initial recognition of the engine problem through the final approach to the forced landing site, demonstrated textbook adherence to emergency procedures and sound aeronautical judgment. The investigation concluded that Rick had maximized his chances of survival through proper crew resource management and aircraft handling, making his death by predator attack all the more tragic. Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks biologist Dr. Kevin Martinez conducted the wildlife investigation, focusing on Bear 411's behavior patterns and the circumstances that led to the fatal encounter with Rick. Dr. Martinez, a 39-year-old expert in large carnivore behavior with 15 years of experience studying grizzly bears, had worked closely with Dr. Rodriguez on previous research projects and was intimately familiar with Bear 411's history and territorial patterns. The necropsy performed on Bear 411 revealed a healthy male grizzly in excellent physical condition for entering hibernation, with fat reserves indicating successful completion of his autumn foraging activities. The bear showed no signs of disease, injury, or other factors that might have contributed to abnormally aggressive behavior toward humans. Dr. Martinez's investigation concluded that Bear 411 had responded normally to encountering an injured human in his territory during a period when his predatory instincts were heightened by pre-hibernation feeding drives. The recovery of Rick's remains required a complex operation involving specialized equipment and personnel due to the remote location and challenging terrain. A National Guard CH-47 Chinook helicopter was deployed to lift the aircraft wreckage from the crash site, while Rick's body was transported separately in a specialized container that preserved evidence for the coroner's investigation. Lewis and Clark County Coroner Dr. Margaret Foster conducted the official autopsy, documenting the extensive trauma Rick had sustained during the bear attack, while also identifying injuries consistent with the aircraft crash. Dr. Foster, a forensic pathologist with 12 years of experience in rural Montana, had previous experience with wildlife fatalities, but had never encountered a case involving the combination of aircraft accident survival and subsequent predator attack. The autopsy revealed that Rick had survived the aircraft crash with serious but not immediately life-threatening injuries. The head laceration, dislocated shoulder, and suspected rib fractures would have required medical treatment but would not have prevented his survival in a wilderness environment for several days under normal circumstances. The cause of death was officially listed as massive trauma due to bear attack, with the aircraft accident listed as a contributing factor that placed Rick in the situation where the wildlife encounter occurred. Rick's family was notified of his death on the evening of November 8th, beginning a period of grief and shock that would be compounded by the unusual circumstances of his passing. Sarah Evans, Rick's wife of 26 years, received the news from Lewis and Clark County Sheriff's Deputy Amanda Richardson, who had volunteered for the difficult assignment due to her experience with family notifications in traumatic cases. Sarah, a 51-year-old elementary school teacher in Billings, had been expecting Rick home for dinner when the sheriff's deputy arrived at her door. The couple had maintained a tradition of family dinners on Friday evenings, often including their daughter Jennifer and her fiancé when their schedules permitted. Sarah's world changed irrevocably when Deputy Richardson explained that Rick's aircraft had crashed in the Helena National Forest and that he had been killed by a grizzly bear while awaiting rescue. Jennifer Evans learned of her father's death through a phone call from her mother at 9:47 p.m. while working the evening shift at St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula. Jennifer, who had followed her father's adventurous spirit by pursuing a career in emergency nursing, was initially unable to process the information that her seemingly invincible father had been killed in such an extraordinary manner. The combination of aircraft crash and bear attack seemed like something from a movie rather than the reality of losing the most important man in her life. The media coverage of Rick's death began within hours of the official confirmation, with local news stations in Billings, Helena, and Missoula reporting the basic facts of the aircraft crash and bear attack. The unusual nature of the incident quickly attracted national attention, with major news networks sending reporters to Montana to cover what was being described as a perfect storm of wilderness survival challenges. CNN correspondent Michael Zhang arrived in Helena on November 9th to cover the story for national television, interviewing search and rescue personnel, wildlife officials, and aviation experts about the factors that contributed to Rick's death. Zhang's reporting focused on the irony of surviving a catastrophic aircraft crash only to be killed by wildlife while awaiting rescue, highlighting the unpredictable dangers present in America's wilderness areas. The story reached international prominence when the BBC's Nature documentary unit expressed interest in producing a program about human-wildlife conflicts in North America, using Rick's case as an example of how modern aviation technology intersects with ancient predator-prey relationships. Dr. Rodriguez declined to participate in the documentary, feeling that Bear 411's death had been portrayed too negatively in early media coverage. Rick's funeral was held on November 15th at the First Presbyterian Church in Billings, with over 400 people attending to honor a man who had touched many lives through his aviation career and community involvement. The service was conducted by Reverend Thomas Mitchell, who had known Rick for over 15 years through the church's Men's Fellowship program and various community service projects. Captain Walsh and her helicopter crew attended the funeral in dress uniform, representing the military's respect for Rick's Air Force service and their role in the tragic events of November 8th. Staff Sergeant Chen, who had discovered Rick's remains and killed Bear 411, struggled with complex emotions about her actions during the rescue operation, While she understood intellectually that killing the bear had been necessary for her own safety and to recover Rick's body, she also mourned the death of a magnificent wild animal that had been following its natural instincts. The Montana Pilots Association established the Richard Evans Memorial Scholarship Fund to support aspiring aviators pursuing careers in mountain and wilderness flying, recognizing Rick's contributions to aviation safety and his dedication to serving remote communities throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The scholarship would provide financial assistance to student pilots learning the specialized skills required for operating aircraft in challenging mountain environments. Sarah Evans faced the difficult process of rebuilding her life after losing her partner of 26 years in such traumatic circumstances. The couple's financial security was protected by Rick's life insurance policies and aviation industry retirement benefits, but the emotional devastation of his death created challenges that would require years of professional counseling and family support to overcome. The investigation reports were completed and released over a period of 6 months, with the NTSB publishing its final findings on May 15, 2025. The report concluded that Rick's death was the result of a chain of events initiated by a mechanical failure in his aircraft's left engine, complicated by challenging terrain that prevented a safe emergency landing, and culminated by a wildlife encounter that reflected the inherent risks of wilderness survival in grizzly bear habitat. The FAA used Rick's case as the basis for new guidance material regarding emergency procedures for single-engine operations in mountainous terrain, emphasizing the importance of maintaining situational awareness about wildlife hazards when forced landings occur in remote areas. The guidance recommended that pilots carry bear spray as standard emergency equipment when flying over known bear habitat, though experts acknowledged that such preparation might have limited effectiveness in situations like Rick's, where injuries compromise a pilot's ability to respond effectively to wildlife threats. Dr. Rodriguez published a scientific paper about Bear 411's behavior patterns and the circumstances leading to the fatal encounter, using GPS collar data and crime scene analysis to reconstruct the events of November 8th with unprecedented detail. The paper contributed to the scientific understanding of grizzly bear responses to novel stimuli in their environment, particularly the attractant effects of aviation fuel and human blood that had drawn Bear 411 to the crash site. The crash site itself was cleaned up during the summer of 2025, with all aircraft debris removed and environmental remediation completed to address fuel contamination of soil and groundwater. The location where Rick died was marked with a small memorial plaque installed by the U.S. Forest Service, acknowledging both his sacrifice as an aviator serving rural communities and the tragic intersection of human activity with wilderness wildlife. Bear 411's death represented a significant loss to the Northern Continental Divide grizzly bear population, as mature breeding males play crucial roles in maintaining genetic diversity and territorial structure within bear communities. Dr. Rodriguez's research had documented Bear 411's successful reproduction with multiple females over his estimated 15-year lifespan, contributing at least 12 cubs to the local population during his prime breeding years. The incident sparked renewed debate about human activities in grizzly bear habitat, with some advocating for increased restrictions on aviation operations over critical wildlife areas, while others argued that such restrictions would compromise essential services to rural communities. The controversy reflected the ongoing challenges of balancing human needs with wildlife conservation in the modern West. Staff Sergeant Chen was awarded the Air Force Commendation Medal for her actions during the rescue operation, recognizing her courage in inserting into dangerous terrain and her quick thinking in neutralizing the bear threat that could have claimed additional lives. The award citation specifically noted her professionalism in completing the recovery mission despite the traumatic circumstances of discovering Rick's remains. The psychological impact of Rick's death extended far beyond his immediate family to include the many professionals who had known him throughout his aviation career. Air traffic controllers who had worked with Rick over the years struggled with questions about whether different guidance or procedures might have altered the outcome of his emergency, while fellow pilots grappled with their own vulnerability when flying over the wilderness areas that were an integral part of mountain aviation. Mountain Air Cargo Services, Rick's employer, implemented new safety procedures following the accident, including requirements for dual pilot operations on flights over designated wilderness areas, and enhanced survival equipment standards for all aircraft operating in remote regions. The company also established closer coordination with search and rescue organizations to improve response times for future emergencies. The Lewis and Clark County Search and Rescue Organization used Rick's case as a training scenario for future wilderness rescue operations, emphasizing the importance of wildlife awareness and the need for armed security when operating in bear habitat during certain seasons. The training materials developed from this incident have been shared with search and rescue organizations throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Sarah Evans eventually returned to her teaching position, but found that her perspective on life had been fundamentally altered by Rick's death. She became an advocate for aviation safety improvements and wildlife conservation, speaking at conferences and community events about the lessons learned from her husband's tragedy. Her advocacy work provided a constructive outlet for her grief, while contributing to positive changes that might prevent similar incidents in the future. Jennifer Evans completed her nursing degree and specialized in emergency trauma care, driven partly by her desire to help others who faced life-threatening situations like those her father had encountered. She married her fiancé Michael in a small ceremony on what would have been Rick's 53rd birthday, knowing that her father would have wanted her to continue building her life despite the tragedy. Dr. Martinez's wildlife investigation led to new protocols for managing bear-human conflicts in aviation emergency situations, including rapid deployment of wildlife specialists to crash sites in known bear habitat and improved coordination between search and rescue teams and wildlife managers. These protocols have been adopted by agencies throughout the Rocky Mountain states and portions of Canada with similar wildlife populations. The King Air's engine manufacturer issued a service bulletin following the NTSB investigation, recommending enhanced inspection procedures for power turbine assemblies approaching the time interval where Bear 411's engine had failed. While the failure was determined to be within normal wear parameters, the bulletin provided additional guidance for operators to monitor engine health and plan for potential emergencies. Captain Walsh continued her search and rescue career and was promoted to Major in 2026, partly in recognition of her professional handling of the challenging rescue operation on November 8th. She has since participated in over 60 additional search and rescue missions and has become an instructor in mountain rescue techniques at the Air Force Survival School. The meadow where Rick encountered Bear 411 has returned to its natural state, with no visible signs of the tragedy that occurred there on a cold November morning. Wildlife cameras installed by researchers have documented that the area continues to serve as a travel corridor for elk, deer, and other bears, including a young female grizzly that may be one of Bear 411's offspring beginning to establish her own territory. Rick's story serves as a sobering reminder of the risks inherent in aviation operations over wilderness areas and the unpredictable nature of wildlife encounters in their natural habitat. His death represents a convergence of circumstances so unlikely that it serves as both a statistical anomaly and a cautionary tale about the hazards faced by those who work and travel in America's most remote regions. The intersection of modern aviation technology with primitive wilderness survival scenarios continues to challenge search and rescue professionals, wildlife managers, and aviation safety specialists. Rick's case has become a reference point for training and planning purposes, helping others prepare for the complex emergencies that can occur when aircraft accidents place humans in direct contact with large predators. The broader implications of Rick's death extend to policy discussions about wilderness management, aviation safety regulations, and the growing interface between human activities and wildlife habitat as development pressures increase throughout the Rocky Mountain West. His tragedy illustrates that even the most experienced and well-trained individuals can fall victim to circumstances beyond their control when multiple systems fail simultaneously. The memorial plaque at Rick's crash site bears a simple inscription: Captain Richard Evans, 1972 to 2024, dedicated aviator who served his community with skill and courage. His final flight reminds us that the wilderness demands our respect and preparation. The plaque is visited annually by members of his family and aviation colleagues who ensure that his sacrifice is not forgotten. The scientific knowledge gained from studying Bear 411's behavior and the circumstances of the fatal encounter has contributed to improved understanding of grizzly bear ecology and human-wildlife conflict management. This research continues to inform conservation strategies and safety protocols throughout bear habitat, potentially preventing future tragedies while supporting the recovery of grizzly bear populations. Rick's legacy lives on through the scholarship fund established in his memory, which has supported 12 student pilots in pursuing careers in mountain aviation. Each recipient receives training in wilderness survival and wildlife awareness as part of their scholarship requirements, ensuring that future aviators are better prepared for the challenges Rick faced on his final flight. The story of November 8, 2024, serves as a profound reminder that nature operates by laws older and more powerful than human technology or planning. Rick Evans, an experienced pilot and careful professional, did everything right in managing his aircraft emergency, but could not account for the presence of an 850-pound grizzly bear following ancient instincts in the wilderness where his aircraft came to rest. His death stands as testimony to both human courage in the face of mechanical failure and the awesome power of the natural world that surrounds our modern civilization. In the end, Rick's story transcends the immediate tragedy to become a meditation on risk, preparation, and the unpredictable nature of life in the modern West. His experience reminds us that despite our technological capabilities and safety systems, we remain vulnerable to the fundamental forces of nature when we venture into the wild places that still exist beyond our complete control. The grizzly bear that killed him was simply following the behavioral patterns that had ensured his species' survival for millennia, making Rick's death both a personal tragedy and a reminder of our place in the larger ecosystem we share with creatures whose power and instincts we can respect but never fully tame.